so we're going to go like an hour and a half or so, and then we finish off the conversation that we started at the end of the morning session, which we really liked. So we're going to return to that, to the immediate post-war moment. Return to the independent group that I think Beatriz you were hearing about, the independent group in London in the 1950s. And from Beatriz's perspective, we would have heard it in terms of, let's say, warfare and brutalism and so on. We're going to look at the same moment, but from a slightly different angle. And in particular, starting with this image, which is sort of very iconic image, which is coming out with a weird proportion, should be more or less a square. And this is a collage by 1956 by the British artist Richard Hamilton, who died just last year. And the label of the image is something like what is it that makes today's homes so different and so appealing. And that line, which is the name of the work, is also taken from an advertisement. And the image itself, of course, is made up of the advertisement. And this image got kind of canonized in the kind of history of the concept of pop art. And one of the key accomplishments of the independent group was to create this category of the pop art and of the pop artists and so on. And when people write about pop art, they always refer to this image. Partly they also refer to the fact that the word pop appears in the middle of the image because the sort of Charles Atlas figure is holding a kind of pop thing. But the actual history of this image is quite complex and its effect is quite complex. But you can see it in some ways relates to the conversation we were having this morning, and that is to say, you are clearly looking at an interior, but not just any interior, right? Because the label is, just what is it that makes today's homes so different, so appealing. So it's really an image of homes in general, like the interior in general. It's a kind of image of what the interior is thought to be at that moment of time. So you're looking at an idealized image of what would be the ideal interior, and the interior is entirely made up out of images that have come from the outside, in many senses. They've come from the outside because they've come from the world of advertising. So images have been brought into an interior from an outside, but in this case the interior is itself made of those images, right? So that everything is a collage. And of course you can see that it's an interior that's not closed, like actually at first it seems like a closed box, but then you see that the earth itself is floating apart. So the interior is actually sort of floating in outer space. Or you could say more precisely, the interior is floating in the space defined by a kind of collage of images. Right? And it is a kind of photo collage. Even the image of what you're seeing through the window, which would normally be considered to the outside, is the image of an outside made up of advertisements. So even the inside and the outside are all made up of a continuous flow of images, in which, of course, the two people that you see are not like your parents, or maybe they are, in which case you should just keep very quiet about it. So they're sort of like, they're like two almost naked people who are sort of exaggerated, right? In the same way that the world of advertisement presents you a mirror in which you see yourself stronger, more beautiful, faster, etc. than you are. So in theory, you should buy the product associated with that advertisement so that you can, as it were, become like the advertisement. So if you make an interior that's made up entirely out of images from the outside, you just represent a sort of exaggerated view. And of course, you could then sort of analyze all of the ingredients of this, if you have the television set, you have like enough familiar elements to make you think this is really what a house is, but then when you look at it in more detail, the image of the house becomes more complicated. And if you look at sort of summary histories of art of the 20th century, you will see this image again and again and again. It's a kind of a go-to image in which the writers feel like everything is explained about the 1950s. In fact, this image was produced in July of 1956 as an image to advertise this particular installation in an exhibition. So it's important to notice that this image is itself an advertisement. So it's an advertisement for an exhibition made up of advertisements. Right? So you can see there, so you're looking at one part of this exhibition. On the left you can see a very, very big kind of curved screen. It's a portion of CinemaScope, which was the big technology at that time for wideband movies. And it's filled up with movie stars in a kind of collage. Then there's a jukebox, full of what you would call today pop music. And even the idea that pop music is called pop music is coming from this. And then on the other side, you see a large plastic beer bottle, and then you see Marilyn Monroe in her most sort of iconic image, but behind her is a robot holding a sort of damsel in distress and so on. So it's part of an exhibition which is made up out of kind of iconography taken from the world of popular culture. And again, the moment I say that this is iconography, that these are icons, I'm using a classical language of art of the icon, but also referring to the way in systems of science you have icons and symbols and so on. But the world of popular culture is being treated as a source of artistic images. This installation that you're looking at was actually carried out by Richard Hamilton, the artist, John McHale, who was an artist, and John Mulder, who was an architect, as part of a bigger exhibition called This Is Tomorrow, which was in August and September of 1956. So basically it's an entire exhibition devoted to the idea of this is tomorrow. We are already living in a world of images of the future. And there were about 8 or 9 different teams in the exhibition. And with each team there was an architect, one architect, and typically one architect and two artists. This exhibition is usually falsely identified as an independent group exhibition. Right? And the catalogue of the exhibition, which you see sitting on the table there, This Is Tomorrow catalogue in front of this guy who cannot keep his eyes off Marilyn Monroe. So, I mean, during the course of this photograph, the guy couldn't stop or was asked to keep looking at this. They printed 1,000 copies of this catalog, which now costs you about $3,000 if you want to buy a copy. You can see, of course, that probably to your eye, not much is going on in this image. In other words, there's a kind of a collage and it doesn't seem that kind of adventurous. At the time, this was treated as an absolutely shocking environment. The thing about the independent group, which Beatriz already referred to you, which is a group of artists and photographers and musicians and advertisers and psychologists and so on, a very loose-knit kind of group, known as the independent group. The important thing to know is that they were not independent. In other words, they were not free. They had always had their meetings at the ICA in London, which was the sort of most prestigious place for exhibiting contemporary art. And they were not a group, they hated each other. All of these people are very, very talented, very, very ambitious. And basically an independent group meeting was a chance for each of them to prove how stupid the other members of the group were. And this is often the case, that groups that are very, very strong and have a very, very big impact. One of the reasons that they have a lot of impact is that they kept telling each other they were idiots, and there was a kind of a warfare going on in the group. And this warfare actually produced incredibly strong work. Whenever you read a great magazine, you say to yourself, this is a terrific magazine, you could look at the group of editors and you will almost certainly always find out that they're fighting with each other. Because they're fighting with each other, they keep really competing to produce better and better material. So, and you're always in this sort of chicken and egg situation. Was the independent group a group of 10 amazing people, or was it that if you were a member of that group, you would become amazing because it was an amazing group, and so you ended up, it's like going to school. So what happened is that we are in this immediate post-war period in which there is a general sense, of course, that life will change enormously, and the question is in which direction will it move. And there's a rejection of the parents. So for all of these people, they regarded the generation before them as absolutely uninteresting. So you have, for example, in this group, Rainer Banham, whose teacher was Nicholas Pesner, and Nicholas Pesner writes The Pioneers of Modern Design and was one of the two most influential historians of modern architecture. Banham was a student of Pesner, but his PhD thesis basically was devoted to proving that his father, Nicholas Pesner, was wrong. And Pesner was one of those interesting guys that liked to have a student that would challenge him. The group, independent group, is also important to note, includes great writers like Rainer Banham, Lawrence Alloway, and John McHale. And if you don't have good writers in your group, nobody's going to know who the hell you are, because you're never going to be written about. It, of course, included very, very strong artists like Richard Hamilton, Eduardo Palazzi, and so on. Less well-known artists, also very good, like David Turnbull and others. Also included very, very strong architects, most notably Alison and Peter Smithson, an amazing musician, Frank Cordell, who was at that time the guy that would always write the music for win the Oscars and so on. He was one of the most popular composers and arrangers and had a huge band. Less well-known people that worked in the areas of advertising and so on. And they would announce that they were going to have a meeting at the ICA where they would argue about something. And also less well-known is that many of those meetings were cancelled because nobody showed up. And many of those meetings only had one or two figures in them. But the mythology is that you have this amazing independent group with all these people that meet and have these incredibly intense discussions, produce all this amazing work and change the field. In fact, by the time of this exhibition in August of 1956, the independent group had completely dissolved. So this is not an independent group exhibition, this is a post-independent group, it's a kind of post-breakup exhibition. They met for a short time period, more or less 3 years, from 1952 to 1955. If you want to say when did they first start to get to know each other, we have to go back a little bit to 1951, and then we might stretch it up to 1956. So we might be able to say 5 years of activity of the independent group. During that time, there were lots of stops and starts. It was just a set of meetings with scattered attendance and almost no documentation. They produced a set of exhibitions, normally by different combinations. So Alison B. Smithson would produce an exhibition with Eduardo Palazzi and so on. There was no one event or exhibition that they were all part of. They were all around 30 years old, and they were all, as I was saying before, reacting really, really strongly against the previous generation. They were determined to be different. For almost all of them, this was the first club that they had ever been a part of, the first gang that they were in. In a sense, they were also teaching. All of them were teaching in art schools for the first time. In a sense, they were kind of still at school. Maybe the independent group was sort of like a graduate school that they all went to. They were like teaching themselves. It was, to use a more contemporary language, it was like an incubator. In that incubation space, they were able to develop radical thinking. Why do we know anything about the independent group, or why do we care about it? Of course, many of the group would become super famous. I mean, it's really hard to find an artist more high level and respected than David Hamilton. Sorry, Richard Hamilton. And certainly Alison B. Smithson are absolutely the top of their generation architecturally, and Rainer Banham is the single most influential post-war architectural historians, and Eduardo Palazzi is one of the figures of the English art scene. So a lot of very, very big names came out of that. But more to the point, I think we're fascinated with the group because there were not only a group of writers like Lawrence Alloway and Rain Banham, but there were also artists that wrote very well. Richard Hamilton is a very good writer, very clear writer, and also Alison and Peter Smithson are architects, but they also write really well. They had direct access to the most influential journals of the day, which were Architectural Design and Architectural Review. In fact, Rain Banham was on the editorial board of the Architectural Review, so they were actually able to review their own work. So Banham would be able to write a review in Architectural Review of the independent group and never say, actually, I'm right again. Right? So they had a lot of leverage. They themselves spawned new publications like the Arc Magazine, Uppercase Magazine, Living Arts, and so on. So they had their own kind of media output. The dominant reading of the independent group, like the cliche version of the independent group, is that they were an incubator that produced the concept of pop art, not just the concept but also the practice. So the first significant examples of pop art, both the theory and the practice, and in the traditional understanding, they invented the concept of pop art in the English situation, but eventually the concept of pop art will move to the United States and become the basis of the work of Andy Warhol and so on. This story is, I think, much more accurate than is ever realized. In other words, they really did generate this concept of pop art, but it's also much more inaccurate than people realize, because the concept of pop art that is usually referred to in art history is extremely narrowly defined and misses a lot of what it was that the independent group talked about. Also, when people tell the story about the independent group, lots of seemingly marginal figures are included, and seemingly key figures are left out. In other words, there's a sort of, I think, strange choice about who was important and who was not important. Figures like William Turnbull, the sculptor, Tony Lorenzo, who worked in advertising, and Frank Cordell, who worked in music, for example, are just seen to play kind of cameo roles. They're not treated as significant at all, which is a big mistake. And a more detailed account of each one of these so-called marginal figures will change our understanding of the whole group. In fact, there's a kind of resistance to these figures. Nobody really wants to know about them, because if you know about them, then the whole story starts to fall apart. And one thing about historians is they love the stories that they tell. They love them. And they love to be able to say that the story doesn't have to change. So if you're a historian, it's the sign that you're really a good historian is you write a book, and then 10 years later you say, I really don't have to make any changes to this book because just by chance I happen to have been right. So you never really want somebody to work on a marginal side of the story that actually changes the main theme. So even though the independent group is a kind of cult group in the formation of thinking about the history of contemporary art, there has been very little interest in really fully trying to understand what is going on in that group. In fact, I think the resistance that contemporary writers have to these so-called marginal figures is a resistance to the very concept that the group is celebrated for. For example, Frank Cordell, the musician, his Oscar-winning score for the movie Cartoon in Houston, it's like a super original motion picture score cartoon. Just imagine what a terrible film this is. Also notice that the image of the film is also a collage, like the This Is Tomorrow collage, right? In other words, in order to understand the film, you have seen many different scenes from the film. And again, there are two sort of heroes here. It's not a man and a woman, but it's Western, non-Western. And then you have different sort of scenes and architecture and so on built in. So again, in a single image, you get a kind of condensation of all the things that are going on in this hugely exaggerated, dramatic thing. The music for that is composed by Frank Cordell. In other words, if they are theorizing pop art and they're arguing that popular culture actually represents a serious resource of investigation for artists and sociologists and so on, then Frank Cordell is the very thing that's being talked about. He's not just theorizing it, he is the thing. So to marginalize him makes absolutely no sense. If you again, here's a mock-up of a cover for a record by Frank Cordell and his orchestra called The Many Faces of Eve, and you notice within the mock-up you get all these different images of women's eyes and lips. So basically, this is again a kind of a collage that, a very structured collage that zooms in on the lips and the eyes to produce a kind of mega image in which the idea of the eyes and the idea of the lips is kind of exaggerated. And this collage was done by John McHale, who's one of the other artists in the group that nobody ever wants to talk about, for a record by Frank Cordell. Now, at that time, McHale was very much an artist, so this was produced in this kind of context. And this is before we start to think about the key role played by other people who were not even in the group itself. But there was, for example, the architect Theo Crosby, who we'll learn a little bit more about, who was a kind of enabler of all sorts of situations. It was Theo Crosby that organized the This Is Tomorrow exhibition. So there is also kind of not just marginal figures, but like off to one side figures, a kind of enablers that operate. And I want to concentrate with you on this guy, John McHale. Of course, you can tell that he's an artist because he's wearing a white T-shirt, and he's wanting to be photographed and to look like an artist. And this is an image of him in the 1950s. The reason I would like to concentrate on McHale is because he's on both sides of this divide, because he entered the group as an artist, but then started, after the group formed a kind of post-artist identity, but at the very heart of the independent group operations. And ultimately, he leaves the art world behind to become a kind of a scholar in his own right. So he's an easy figure for us to sort of think this wider question, what's going on with art and media in this moment. But also, I think the story of what's going on with McHale relates to our general question of what's going on with the interior. It's not by accident, but that image of Hamilton becomes the image for representing what it is that was going on in this moment. Anyway, the standard story is, it all circles around this one image, and basically this image is treated as the seminal work of pop art. By the way, it's very small. It's like 4 inches by 4 inches. You can go and see it. It's in a collection somewhere in Germany. Maybe it's in Cologne or something like that. It's really, really small. And this is identified as, usually identified as the seminal work of pop art. And therefore, Richard Hamilton himself is portrayed as a key part of that. But of course, the This Is Tomorrow exhibition, which this was an advertisement for, was the only exhibition in which almost all of the group appeared, but it happens after the independent group, and involved many other figures, like the architect John Volker, who were not part of the independent group. The last meeting of the independent group was in July of 1955, so it's basically a year after the group has fallen apart. But the concept of the collaborative exhibition, they had already talked about. Now what happens is a very generic idea about what is pop art gets associated with this image, which is associated with an iconic installation, the one you saw before with Marilyn Monroe and so on, which is associated with an iconic group, the independent group, which is whose inner workings remain mysterious. In other words, we have the independent group, or often it's referred to as the IG. You have the IG, which is the magic incubator of an exhibition, inside which there is an exhibition for which there is an advertisement, and that advertisement is like, so when you look at this image, everything is in this image. It all should somehow flow out of the image. But let's follow the chain backwards to go back to the source of the operation. This installation was done by Richard Hamilton, John McHale, and John Volker. It was a multimedia, multi-central blast. You have a curved screen of film images opposite a giant robot and Marilyn Monroe, a huge bottle of beer, a jukebox playing popular songs. There is behind that wall, a projected film loop of Navy maneuvers. There's an angled structure with strawberry perfume coming out of the floor when you walk. So when you walk on the floor, it releases some sort of strawberry perfume. The floor itself is sort of spongy. There's a series of optical illusions and so on. Now we're looking at we're looking behind the Marilyn Monroe wall, and you see you enter a sort of spongy space there with a projector and various optical illusions. There's a whole kind of corridor filled with these kinds of illusions. There are spinning discs of Marcel Duchamp, and there are amplified sounds from other visitors. So when you're in one part of the installation, you can hear the noise of other visitors to the installation. There is, in the very center of this space, a kind of, if you go through that door in the middle, there's a kind of, it's as if you're inside a spaceship and there are aliens trying to get in to get you through the portholes and weird kind of noises. There's dribbled fluorescent paint seen in black light, so it's an incredible sort of multimedia sensual thing. The exhibition was famously opened by Robbie the Robot. So this is the exhibition opening. And Robbie the Robot, which is from the movie, who was the main star of the movie Forbidden Planet, which is the movie which is coming out in that moment, read a speech by Lawrence Alloway about the future of art. So the robot is reading the speech. And Rainer Banham would later describe this whole thing as the first pop art manifestation. So what, you know, it's just full on. You have to really get this kind of full on situation. You see, that's Lawrence Alloway, as it were, whispering to the robot what to say. And that's Frank Woodell's head behind the opening there. And by the way, on that panel to the right of the robot is a whole series of advertisements. And included in the advertisement is a very small image of a Van Gogh painting, because they figured out this was the most popular painting in the universe. The most recognized painting, which means the painting that is most often to be found in suburban houses on the walls. Right? So they had a very, and again, that piece of installation, to my knowledge, has never been analyzed by anyone, despite the fact that it is actually a wall devoted to the question of the world of advertising and the world of art to be found within advertising. So inside this exhibition is actually a section of the exhibition which is almost like an explanation of the whole exhibition. But of course this label of pop art and the idea that this is a pop art manifestation is a retrospective label. There was absolutely no mention of the word pop or even of popular in the exhibition. This is tomorrow. Thanks. And the exhibition was much more anti-art than art. Like the main, which one? the main purpose of the exhibition was as an anti-art statement, right? And of course, it's possible that the arrival of pop art requires the death of previous forms of art. So one could do an anti-art show with a new kind of art as its consequence. But this was really not in any way theorized by any of the people doing this work. This was not understood to be an art installation in that sense. And the collage itself that is so famously referred to, you see on the right, was actually not part of the exhibition, but was an advertisement for the exhibition. And then that same image, and it was used in black and white. So even the fact that the image is in color is irrelevant to its in fact use. You have to really think of it as a black and white image, which was used on this poster on the right to advertise the exhibition. But it's also used, as you can see, in the catalogue on the left of the whole exhibition. But that image, that isolated collage, was not exhibited as a work of art until the 1964 exhibition of Richard Hamilton in the Hanover Gallery. So basically, almost like 8 years later, it was 8 years before that image was thought of as a work of art. And when it's appearing here on this poster, it's not thought of as an artwork either. It's literally thought of as a kind of intelligent advertisement for kind of a concept. The term pop art is usually credited to Lawrence Alloway, and in particular to a 1958 article that he wrote called The Arts and the Mass Media. In other words, the word pop art, the use of the word pop art, the invention of the concept of pop art by the independent group actually happens in 1958, 3 years after the independent group has collapsed, and is then retroactively used to explain the exhibition. And you might say, that's okay. They had this group that incubated a new concept. The group fell apart. They all got back as a kind of reunion in an exhibition where one more time they got a chance to show each other that they were each more smart than the other. And they produced this work, which then when some of them later invented the concept of pop art, that actually was a good explanation of what they were doing before. It's possible to argue that, but you're going to have to make the argument. You're going to have to go through all the steps. You cannot, and you should never imagine that this was intended or perceived or received as a work of pop art. Not by chance, the article in which the expression pop art appears is called The Arts and the Mass Media, so it's about the relation between art and media. Not by accident, it's actually published in an architectural magazine. So the first time the expression pop art is used by Galloway in an architectural magazine. And also not by chance, it's used actually not in the article itself, but in the caption for one of the images. And in fact, it appears there not as pop art, but as the expression mass popular art. Now the concept, basically the concept of pop art, as explained by figures like Lawrence Galloway, was that it's not that we live in a world of high art, like, you know, Leonardo da Vinci, Michelangelo, etc., and low art, like bad television and advertisements and so on. But there is what they call a continuum between them. There's a continuous sort of scale that goes all the way from the super popular to the super high, and there's actually a little bit of the super high inside the popular and a little bit of the popular inside the super high. So they were interested in this, in blurring the lines between the high and the low. This was their main concept. The last sentence of the article of Lawrence Galloway says that the new role of the fine arts is to become one of the possible forms of communication in an expanding framework that also includes the mass arts. So in other words, even if you're a high artist, you have to see yourself as being part of a very broad spectrum that goes all the way from the high arts through to the popular arts. And in fact, he says expanding framework, and expansion was really the main thing. The independent group was obsessed with the expansion. Expansion of categories. In other words, if you're an artist, you should also think about science fiction, B-grade movies, and so on. Also in the sense of expansion, like more people using things, like more people are looking at popular images than are looking at high images, so that kind of concept. Wide in the sense of horizontal, like cinemascope, like the wide view, like the popular view, popular itself being more horizontal than hierarchical. Literally wide, and they love, for example, American cars that had these windshields that were so big. They wrote articles in architecture magazines about the architecture of the view that you see through an American car. Billboards, cinemascope, etc. They love the idea of all-inclusive, all-embracing, all-enveloping imagery. But pop art, which is to say, art which is based on this new expanded view, is only analysed as such in 1961. In other words, the expression pop art is appearing in a Lawrence Galloway essay in 1958. Pop art as a conscious practice by an artist is only being discussed in 1961. In fact, you can do a kind of history. If you look at independent discussions, first of all, in 1958 they're referring to popular arts. Then they abbreviate it to pop arts. Then it becomes pop art. Then it becomes pop art with a capital P on pop. Then it becomes pop art with a capital P on pop and art. And then it becomes pop, all capitals. So there's a sort of evolution from a concept of the popular through to a new thing, pop. Right? And of course, pop itself has the sound of pop. Pop is like, sounds already like a kind of a product, like an option. And this we can follow very, very carefully through. In fact, Lawrence Galloway first refers to the popular arts in 1954. So that's the top expression. Then he capitalizes both words in 1975. So it takes us from 1954 to 1975 to get to the next part. And actually it's in the late 70s that you get the word pop in capital letters. So actually the emergence of the concept of pop takes a very, very long time and actually straddles England and the United States. Right? So we're just doing a lot of forensic work on a very simple thing, pop art, and where it came from. Eventually you get brilliant moves like the moment that all three letters are capitalized is in a brilliant slogan from Richard Hamilton, where he says, "For the finest art, comma, try pop!" exclamation mark. So again, he's using the language of advertising, like for the finest cigar, try Cuban. For the finest art, means high art, try pop, low art. But not low art, pop, P-O-P, capital P, capital O. So pop, like the popular turned into something, pop. Right? So something that could be like high art, but it's not high, it's low. Lawrence Alloway later argued that the expression pop art had come to mean simply any form of art that refers to mass media, which he thought was a definition that went against the expansionist elements of pop art. The main principle of pop art is not a particular form of behavior, but an expansion of all possible forms of behavior. In other words, the artist could operate on a much, much wider spectrum using a much, much wider range of techniques. So pop art, as thought of by the independent group, is a kind of undoing of the constraint of high art. And as you know, high art is like, you know, like in ballet, it's a discipline. It's all about control. Even if you're a Jackson Pollock and you're dripping paint, you have to be the one that can drip. You can control the uncontrolled. Right? And figures like Pollock were very, very major figures of discussion inside the independent group. Like, there's a lot of discussion of that kind of work. So the idea that pop art is kind of fine art absorbing mass media is a super reduction. And in a sense, the arrival of the capitals, pop, is the kind of commodification of the concept. Like, at that point, it's no longer doing the work that it did. At that point, you could be a pop artist in the same way that you could have been an abstract expressionist, or you could be an action painter. So in a sense, when we get to the concept of pop art, this is absolutely the end of the independent group's expansionist project. It's the death of the independent group. So when people write stories that say that pop art was born in the independent group, it's much better to say that pop art killed the independent group. Pop art was, as it were, the death of the independent group. So let's concentrate now on this 10-year period, which is 1951 when the group first gets to meet, and 1961 when the concept of pop art is, for the first time, pretty coherent as a concept and so on. And let's return to the catalogue. This is tomorrow, in which this iconic image first appears. So here's the cover of the catalogue. And when you turn the pages, it goes, "This is tomorrow." And look at the way in which we actually would experience that image by Richard Hamilton. It will appear on the left, and on the right you will get a kind of optical image. And of course, what this is a reference to are the two sides of the exhibition, This is Tomorrow. Remember, there is the op art side. You see the figure in the middle of this kind of claw, which is the one you see on the right. So in other words, the right-hand side of this page represents the right-hand side of the exhibition. And the left-hand side represents, of course, the left-hand side. So here we are now looking between the two. You see, we're looking at the central piece. To the left, as you look at it, are a whole series of multimedia mass images producing a sense of interior. To the right is a kind of optical abstract space, and that's what that page is doing. So the first thing to note is you can never, when thinking about the This Is Tomorrow exhibition, isolate that image on the left from the image on the right. But most times people will refer to that installation of McHale, Volcker, and Hamilton. They will not talk about this side. They just don't find it interesting because it doesn't participate in their concept of pop art. You see here, these are, of course, are the spinning wheels of Marcel Duchamp. These are the actual wheels of Duchamp. And this is the sort of optical, and this is with the spongy floor producing the strawberry flavor. Now we're looking at the other end, and you can see that when you enter that sort of central space, which is sort of like a little house, right? To the left, you have the world of the optical, and to the right, you have the world of mass media images. And in fact, the image you see on the left there was produced from a drawing by John McHale, but the actual image was then crafted by Richard Hamilton. And the image you have on the right is a dense collage of food. They were obsessed with food, by the way, getting back to the Instagram conversation. So that image you can see on the right is just a whole lot of chocolate cake. And in particular, the British were obsessed with American chocolate cake. Because you know America, there is this idea that instead of making a cake by having a secret recipe, or you could just buy a box which has a big picture of a cake on the outside, and you pull out a sachet which has a powder in it, you put a powder in it, and you mix some water, and you wait a certain amount of time, and then poof, you get this cake which has no taste or flavour, because that would cost the people that make the cake money, but it has the perfect image of cake. So when you eat the Betty Crocker cake mix, you're eating an image of a cake, which could be more satisfying than eating a cake. Like imagine I eat a lump of stuff and it has the pure taste of cake, but it doesn't look like a cake. Right? It's probably not very satisfying. It's probably like I had a pill that tasted like a cake. Not a very pleasant experience. But if I have something that looks like a cake, feels like a cake, but doesn't taste like a cake, I still had cake. Right? So actually, from this sort of consumer point of view, the image of the cake is more important than the cake. Or, to say it more precisely, if you have a really, really beautiful photograph of the cake on the box with which you produce the cake, then you'll have all the sensation of the cake, and anyway, who needs the flavor? Right? Which is why, of course, America thinks that dirty water is coffee. Because it's the concept. It's not the... So, of course, you have to remember, in England, this is still rationing, food rationing. They are very, very poor and with very little money and with very little resources. And so these images of these American cakes, and you know how those images are done? They're done so close that you see every little detail, every little piece of a cake is saying, "I'm a piece of cake." And so what this collage is just a huge stack of images of cakes taken from, and spaghetti, cans of spaghetti, the same. Can you imagine in the Italian context that I'm going to make some spaghetti for the family. Right? So, but again, you look at the outside of the tin, and maybe the outside of the tin has an Italian mother cooking for her kids. Right? So again, I'm actually giving you a little bit of Italian history. So they were obsessed by this, and they genuinely saw America as the beginning of the future. So America was whatever the world was going to, and the world was going towards images. Again, if we look to the other side, this was the purpose, of course, of all this. And of course, it's Robbie the Robot. Because, again, Robbie the Robot is really the star of this exhibition. And of course, he's a sort of a super exaggerated figure of the future of mechanization and the future of technology. The future of technology will play this kind of heroic role. The installation was all about interaction. Right? It was basically an interactive space. But we only ever see kind of interaction on one side and not on the other side. Even at the opening of the exhibition, I mean, you know, this thing about people looking at Marilyn Monroe. I mean, and yet you have to understand that this is not like a candid shot. Like this is not an Instagram upload. This is one of the official photographs of the exhibition. So even in the official photographs, there's just this obsession with her and the great secret which she's revealing but not revealing. So in the space of technology, the future, Robbie the Robot will be the future, but the story is the same. The man, the woman, da-da-da-da. So at least we have a sense here of interactivity. We understand the interaction of the people that are visiting. But here's Robbie the Robot after opening the exhibition. He didn't even bother to go and look at the optical side because presumably he couldn't put himself across the... And so he's exiting the exhibition. Lawrence Alloway wrote the introduction to the catalogue of the exhibition and said that the exhibition was all about the spectator. Remember, the exhibition has about 8 or 9 different groups, of which we're just looking at one of them. And essentially he argues that when you look at a work of art, you become part of the work of art. So you become immersed in the work of art. So it's not just a man looking up Marilyn Monroe's dress who would love to be inside part of that image. It's everybody is imagining themselves part of the image that they are looking at. And then Richard Hamilton wrote the catalogue text for the group, for this group, which is called Group Number 2. And he said that the main purpose of their exhibition was to increase the capacity of the spectator. In other words, what it does is expand your capacity to see. And he says, tomorrow can only extend the range of the present body of visual evidence. What is needed is not the definition of meaningful imagery, but the development of our perceptual potentiality to accept and utilize the continual enrichment of visual material. In other words, their installation is a manifesto for the expansion of perception. That whatever the future is, the future will be an expanded ability to perceive. And group number 2 explicitly pursues this project of expanded vision, which seems to be quite different than another group. So here's group number 6, which was in Wigley, Palazzi, Richard Henderson, Alison Smithson, and Peter Smithson. And they did this project that maybe Beatriz talked about, the patio and pavilion. And you see here, the visitors are on a special walkway that keeps them separate from the work that they're contemplating. And look at them looking at it very, very seriously. This is no longer Marilyn Monroe's space. This is like looking at some ancient archaeological kind of ruins. It's sparse, it's quiet, there's a sort of a dirt, there's a shed. It's like going back to the beginnings of things. Here is the shed with a rock, with a head, with various items in it. Obviously, that they're working with a different sensibility. Here are their pages from the catalogue, and you see the 4 of them sitting in the street, and they're trying to give you that working class look. Right? We're in the street, we're people of the street. Of course, if you look at the chairs in which they're sitting, they're like the same chairs you saw from Playboy and so on. So basically they have high design chairs sitting in a street. And you see above the difference. Below you have the 4 of them sitting in the street saying, we're a team, we're a gang, we're a street gang, we're off the streets, and we're going to deal with some fundamental things like rocks, dirt, and so on. Above you see group number 2. Firstly, they have 3 images on the left, which is not of them, but images that they've taken from advertising. So their first move is to present themselves as sort of idealized types taken from the world of advertising. Secondly, they don't appear as a group. Right? There's 3 separate figures on separate images looking in different directions. And then on the right, they present themselves. And you see on the top, Richard Hamilton chooses an image in which he's looking away from us. John McHale is looking at one of his own collage books. And Joel Bomber is the young guy, sort of optimistic, looking up towards the light. But they couldn't be further away from each other. Right? It would seem that ideally, Richard Hamilton would prefer his image to not be on the page at all. Right? They basically maximize the distance. So what they're sort of saying is, we're not a group. Now, of course, what's going on is that with group number 2, absolutely hate each other at that point. So this is a very accurate representation of their interests. But also their interest is much more in a kind of atomized, differentiated, multiplied subjectivity. Each of them is represented by 2 figures, not one. One of the figures actually themselves, and another is a sort of idealized icon from the world of advertising. So suddenly it's as if it's a group of 6 people, some from the media, some from reality. If we go back to the drawings of patio and pavilion, you see the drawing they do. Again, very, very elemental handwriting. It's about what comes before technology, or it's about the earliest possible technology. But again, interesting, you have to note, of course, this is a collage. In other words, it's a drawing in which there's been a photo collage with various elements, like wheels and so on. So even if it seems to you primitive, and seems to be not about the media, it seems to be not about the latest in technology, actually it's a highly technological image that's been produced by the same techniques of media and media collage that's used by the other group. Here's one of the mock-ups they did for the possible catalogue image. Again, a combination of an architectural drawing and the collage in of images. In fact, as probably Beatriz told you, the Smithsons did the drawings for the pavilion, then left. And then the artists basically filled their space with this material, but also they filled the drawings with this material. But then there is this page, and we're still in the catalogue, and it's interesting. It's dealing with all the very, very fundamental architectural issues. So it's really about, this is tomorrow becomes a question of like, what's fundamental? But you'll notice in there, it says artifacts and pin-ups for his irrational urges. In other words, one of the fundamental, most basic pre-media requirements of the human species is actually collages and pin-ups. So the desire to collect things and to make images is somehow part of their story. So in a sense, we would be not so smart if we thought that group number 2 was all about expansion and group number 6 was all about reduction. If one of them is about the new world of the consumer, and the other is about the pre-consumer model. Actually, there's a lot more relationship between the two. Think of collage as a technique. Collage involves bringing many things from the outside to the single space of an image. So many images from many different spaces combine to form one image. So that image is simultaneously expansive in the sense that it reaches out and grabs hold of many things, but it's also very much a condensation because it basically compacts a very wide part of the world into a very small space. So collage is a gesture of expansion and of condensation. That's exactly what collage does. It kind of reaches out and compounds in at the same time, or reaches out in order to push in, or pushes in order to explode out. And this double effect of pulling in and expanding out is a kind of architectural, is an architectural effect, and it is a transformation of the concept of interior. Even when I say reach out, I have to find an inside from which I'm reaching out. But then I reach out and also bring stuff in such an explosive condensation that it goes back out again. So the line between inside and outside remains. So there is a frame to the image, but this line is no longer regulating so easily like this window. It's no longer standing between a stable inside and a stable outside. Inside and outside have been put into this unbelievably complicated dynamic. By the way, when I look out a window, the outside comes in to me, and in that sense, the outside that you see when you look through a window is only ever inside. In fact, you can only ever have that outside from the inside. Like when we look out at the tree here, we see the tree in a very, very particular way. We see an end of the tree. In fact, in this case, we just get the trunk of the tree. And it could be that after the lecture started today, the top of that tree was removed. Now, when you go outside and you see that there's no longer a tree there, it's just the trunk of the tree, you are going to be upset and surprised, right? But right now, conceptually, that's possible, right? So, in fact, all we see is I see a certain, I have a certain idea of that tree which is outside. I can only have that idea inside. So that tree which I imagine to be out there, that tree that's in the garden, the tree that I'm thinking about, can only be in here. So it is in here. Right? So the window as an interface is a machine for allowing the outside to become part of the inside. It's almost like the tree is projected from the inside to the outside. And of course, I'm from New Zealand, so trees are huge in New Zealand because everything just grows in New Zealand. It's just ridiculously fertile. So for me, that's almost not a tree. That's like a children's drawing of a tree. Right? But for some of you who come from places where there are no trees, that's a very big tree and quite surprising to be there. So not just that tree out there is only out there in here. The tree is different for me than it is for you because I create a different tree than you create. So the window allows me and the tree to work out some sort of deal by which I end up building a tree in here. And if I change the shape of that window, I'm going to build a different tree, obviously. So in this sense, the technique of collage is a kind of architectural technique. It acts like a window. But what you see through this window is not a single view, like in this case, the tree. Imagine I look out this window and I see almost all of the trees in this block of the neighborhood. Right? Something that it's more possible in the world of Facebook and Instagram and all of that. In other words, what if I see, and what if it's not just I see a Frankfurt tree, what if I see a tree from all of the countries that are represented in this room? Like, remember that image of the faces of Eve, where you see all the eyes and all the lips. What if I just saw millions of trees from all these different places? Then what I was saying before would still be true, that the tree that I see out there is only out there in here, so really it's in here. But now what would be in here would be what's out in all these different places. So you could say that the technique of collage is the architectural technique of a window multiplied to a much more radical dimension. It's a new way of seeing the world, right? In that moment. And of course, you probably know that the main technique of advertising is to show an image, not exactly of the product, but an image that you associate with the product. In the same way that when you advertise the Betty Crocker cake mix, you don't show the packet of, you could perfectly show a table with some powder on it and say, the Betty Crocker cake mix, delicious. And show a little kid saying, please mum, can I have that cake mix? No, you show the thing you want to associate with the experience. So the collage is also a technique of association. In other words, it puts things that don't belong together and makes it seem as if for a moment they almost illegally belong together. So when Lawrence Alloway says that the purpose of the exhibitions is to put the spectator inside the image, in this case the image you're going to be put inside is not just an image of a painting or a face or some trees, but is a kind of image of the network globalized world of commodities, that you put yourself, let's say, into that world. So actually collage is also in this sense understood as a form of realism. In other words, if I make a photograph of this tree, from the point of view of this thinking in the 1950s, that just would not be a good image of the tree. Now, if I was Picasso, of course I would say it's a terrible image of the tree, because the tree is a kind of idea that you build up after you look at trees from many different angles. So you produce a kind of a cubist tree where I would see all sides of the tree in a single image. But now we go beyond that kind of cubist operation, and you say, okay, what if I see every different kind of tree in a single image? Or what if I see trees and telephones and start to think about the relationship between trees and telephones? This is the kind of logic. Notice also that now we're looking at the space of the exhibition. So you see you enter in at number 1. Number 2 is group number 2. So imagine when you see where the number 2 is. To the left is the optical illusions. To the right is the images, and in the middle is the kind of spaceship thing. And if you go all the way to the very end, you see you get to the far corner, you get to group number 6. But notice that the journey that you take is kind of like an urban journey. So that this is tomorrow simulates a kind of street environment on the inside of the show. In fact, Alloway in the catalogue says the visitor is exposed to space effects, the play with signs, a wide range of materials and structures which taken together make of art and architecture a multi-channel activity as factual and as far from the ideal standards as the street outside. So it's a new kind of street. So again, I'm on the inside of an exhibition building, seeing an image of a possible outside, which is a collage of potential insides made out of outsides, and so on. In fact, the whole exhibition is conceived of as an urban space. It's a series of simulated buildings and so on, and not by accident. It's organized by the architect Theo Crosby, and he was the one that insisted that there had to be one architect in every scene. And by the way, for example, here's the telegram that Theo Crosby sends to Ellison and Peter Smithson after they have left London to go to the Team 10 group, and he's basically saying, it's great, everybody loves it. They have no idea what's going on in this exhibition. Not by chance, all of the key proto-pop articles, all the articles in which the concept of pop is almost there but not quite stated, were published in architectural magazines, as was all of the early work of Eduardo Palazzi, Richard Henderson, and so on. In other words, architecture was the host for the emergence of pop art. Group number 2, of course, tried to produce its own urban environment. They describe it as an attempt to bring the street inside the exhibition. That was their own definition. Collage itself, you could say, is a kind of urban medium. In 1954, Lawrence Alloway and John McHale organized an exhibition called Collages and Objects. So they were really, really interested in what would collage mean. And they described collage as, quote, the contents of the artist's wastepaper basket or the debris of a whole town. In other words, you produce an image out of all the discarded images or on the inside of the artist's studio, or all of the reality, the messy reality of the life outside. Not by chance does Alloway describe mass art, like mass media, as fundamentally urban, and he first uses the term pop art when writing about the city. So there's a whole kind of relationship then between thinking about urban life and thinking about the domestic interior. So the space of collage is not just urban, it's even a kind of a building, and the specific effect of collage, the specific architectural effect, is a kind of domesticity. Like it produces a kind of sense of what is home. Or more precisely, it produces a breakdown in the difference between the domestic and the urban, which is why that collage of Richard Hamilton is so famous, because it's a domestic interior constructed out of images of the exterior. It's a domestic space, obviously, but it's a space that contains everything, including a whole crowd, and even extends to outer space. The group number 2 installation was referred to as a crazy house. It was itself a new form of domesticity, but so too was Patio and Pavilion. It was understood to be a new kind of house. So now we can be a little bit more precise. The independent group was not just an expansion of territory occupied by the existing body or the existing mind, but it was a radical transformation of body and mind. Simultaneously, it was a super high-tech move and a very, very primitive gesture. And you know, in science fiction, you often get this collapsing of the sort of super future and the ancient past. Group number 6, Patio and Pavilion group, they were just as much into expansion as group number 2. Actually, group number 6, Palazzi, Henderson, Allison, and Peter-Smithson, they are the original core of the independent group. A series of proto-independent group meetings were held in 1951 at the Central School of Art, where they were all teaching. And the very first official meeting of the so-called independent group was in 1952, and it was Eduardo Palazzi that presented a series of images like this, which were images he had been collecting since the war, placed in these kind of collage. And you're being invited, and he didn't say anything about the images. For example, you see in this one, this is actually an issue of Architectural Design magazine of January 1950, which has had an October cover girls model kind of collage on top of it, and also the tire of a car. He just showed these images and sort of breathed deeply. Like, as we were saying yesterday, there is this obligation for the architect to explain what she or he is doing, and there's almost an obligation of the artist to not explain anything and have the gallerists and critics and museums do the talk before him. So he'd show these images and just sort of breathed intensely about the deep significance of them all. And they were all smoking, of course, so you have to imagine that there was a huge amount of smoke in the room. And he was using an epidioscope, so he's basically putting these images on. They're not very high quality. And you see that these images, as you see them here, have been signed, like signed in 1948. In fact, none of the images he was showing were signed, and he did not consider them to be works of art. It was only later that they were treated as works of art, and then he went back and signed them and also faked the dates on them. So sometimes you'll see, for example, he will sign 1948 on an image that actually has 1950 visual material in it. Never trust an architect, what they say about the work that they have produced and how they produced it, and certainly never trust the date on an artist's work. And certainly not Palazzi. Palazzi was actually a brilliant artist, but he was a real shit. I mean, he was super badly behaved with regard to the other members of the group. Okay, but these are the kinds of images. And you see, on the one hand, there's an attempt in these images to look as if there's no craft to the image, that they are kind of rough and ready. And this was his kind of, sort of almost brutal attempt to sort of show that this was just like the raw material of perception. This was not refined work. This was he was producing his images and thinking about these images like you would produce, for example, ice cream. His father ran an ice cream store. It was something you would produce. But of course, they're primarily coming from American magazines, magazines that celebrate the good life, and here you see spaghetti on the top and chocolate and this sort of stuff. These images were regarded as miraculous images. Even technically, the independent group absolutely marveled at the high resolution, massive use of color in glossy American magazines. Of course, the tradition of collage is a deep one, and in particular very deep in Germany with figures like Hannah Hock and others, and then developed in a very, very precise way through the Surrealists and Nigel Henderson, for example, who's the sort of partner in crime of Pilotti at that point. Nigel Henderson's mother runs the gallery for Surrealist art. And so Pilotti, they're very, very familiar with Surrealism. So they're not inventing collage, but they're not inventing even the idea of using, let's say, what we would now think of as popular images. But there is a very specific post-war American vibration to these images, and a lack of refinement, which you will never find in Surrealist collage, which is always at a very, very high technical level. And there is no doubt in Surrealist collage as to its ambition to be fine art, which is exactly why the Cobra Group in 1948 and the Letters International took such an offense to Surrealism, because they felt that the unconscious desires had been turned into high art. So what's going on here is an attempt to resist the temptation to turn the popular into art. So this is not understood as art. This is much more understood as science. This is research into the evolution of the perceptual apparatus. Right? This is the new, we don't look at trees anymore. We look at, this is what we look at. This is what we look at, this is what we live in, this is what we move with, this is what we eat. This is a documentation of contemporary life. Here's, for example, the psychological atlas of Pilotti. Again, you could say it's really quite beautiful. You might even want to say it's clearly the work of an artist, etc. But you see an artist trying to look like he's not being an artist, etc., etc. Again, this is the kind of content. Now, retroactively, this can be seen of as works of art. He can even sign this and sell it. But in the moment of production, it's in the world of documentation. He did an amazing series where he does these cuts into Time magazine covers and produces. Again, when I'm looking at the cover, I no longer see a single cover, I see many covers. And then Hamilton even produces this collage of what they thought was going to happen in the independent group show. And he produces this because Architectural Design magazine wants to publish an image of their installation, and they don't have an image, so he makes the image in retrospect. So you can see, of course, the spaghetti, and it's kind of very efficient and very typical of Hamilton, a very, very beautifully constructed image. At a technical level, it's really hard to find somebody more refined in the production of the image than Hamilton. Up here, we're back in the catalogue. You see the original plan of the catalogue. John Volcker originally was very influenced by Van Berkel because he had the idea that the whole thing would be a kind of a continuous strip, right, folded in on itself. So basically the idea was you could actually make the installation by folding up all of these panels, and it would be a continuous curve. And here we see the 2 pages of the catalogue for group number 2 that you haven't seen on the left. On the left is literally the perceptual spectrum, right? The electromagnetic spectrum include where sound and vision come up. This is exactly the zone, and you see it divided radio, television, and photography, and then you see on the image to the right. Now these images were designed by John McHale, who was at the time an art student in Yale University, and he gave instructions to Richard Hamilton on how to produce these images. Hamilton was totally pissed off at McHale because McHale was in Yale having fun as a student, while Hamilton actually had to produce the actual material for the catalogue and so on. So the discussion backwards and forwards with him was really brutal and a lot of fun to read, and super misunderstood in the analysis that you can find. What's going on here is that during the meetings of the independent group, they regarded the evolution of modern media culture as the evolution of a new society that needed to be studied in files, notebooks, scrapbooks, pin-up boards, and so on. They used a whole series of kind of domestic mechanisms to bring the big world in, and they understood collage as a kind of digestion machine. You know, that basically through collage they could eat this new world. For them, it's not just chocolate cake. All of these images were kind of nutrient, very much under the influence of Surrealism, but with this resistance to the production of art. The scrapbooks were not seen as art. what will be later called pop art was, in their minds, found rather than made. Like, they didn't think they made anything, they just were finding things, just noting things. If the ready-made object, following Duchamp, can be turned into art simply by being framed as art, pop art is by definition already art. And that's the key element here, is that all the independent group are saying that the big photograph of the chocolate cake on the cover of the chocolate cake box, that is already work of art. It requires no intervention by anyone. It's already the achievement of art. This is very, very different than Andy Warhol saying, I could take and rebuild the same box and place it into a gallery, which is much more a return to the sort of Duchamp view of the ready-made, whereby you can make art out of a found object. What these guys are arguing is they are finding art that actually, when you read a popular magazine, it's perfectly an art magazine with very, very sophisticated artists producing very, very sophisticated images. So all they were doing was finding the images and analyzing them and then discussing them. So many of the meetings of the independent group were analyzing how does advertising work, how do images work, what is the nature of the media, and so on. They really saw themselves as kind of scientists in that sense. And they saw the scrapbook as being a much more valid mechanism than the art gallery. It would be much better to have a scrapbook full of all sorts of images than to put those images into a museum. So interestingly enough, there is no conscious pop art and no pop architecture. In fact, both Galloway and Rainer Bernholm explicitly oppose the idea of a specifically constructed pop architecture. The one thing they say is you could never produce pop architecture. Yet even the epidioscope, the scrapbook, the pin-up board, the artist studio as a warehouse, the collar, the notebook, all of those things still are kind of frames. Right? They're not innocent. Starting with the scissors with which you cut out an image from a magazine, you are already reframing and transforming the image. Of course, it's the frame that produces the effect of a collage. You could only think of it as a collage if you could think of the constraints of the frame. So in a certain sense, you could say the independent group were dissolving one kind of architecture to expand the view, and then they were constructing another kind of architecture. Palazzi's scrapbooks would be very soon seen as art, and in fact, he showed them to the Hanover Gallery and said, could I show them? And they looked at them and said, these are trash, this is nothing, this is not art. No one could afford to buy them now. The very same objects. For the first time, the collage books produced by members of the group were shown in 1954 at the Collage and Objects exhibition curated by Galloway, where he showed the psychological atlas and his collages in 1950 and so on. In 1972, he even turned his original epidioscope images into a limited edition series, and which was exhibited at the Victoria and Albert in 1973, where the originals are. So in other words, they're kind of collections, they're scrapbooks, the galleries, limited editions of museums, and then the official collection. They went increasingly towards high art and towards a kind of fixed image of pop art. The problem is, of course, that the expanded frame that they invented is still a frame. Collage is, yes, it's an expansion technique. It constructs a new kind of space, a kind of urban space, by bringing the outside in, by turning the outside into a kind of interior. It produces the domesticity of an intimate space of the body. So here you have on the left John McHale, and leaning down on his knees there is Richard Hamilton doing the actual installation, and that's Theo Crosby, the architect from South Africa, who's watching. And they're in the business of actually producing this exhibition. But interestingly, this other collage that Hamilton produced tries to show, if we look at it, the Moebius strip idea. That was the original concept of the kind of loop. The Moebius strip being, of course, a figure of the lack of any difference between inside and outside, right? Interior without interior. But this was not just dissolving the limits of vision. It was all the senses, as revealed in that chart that we saw before, all of the operations. This idea was coming from McHale. Hamilton was very much interested in what McHale was doing. And so we actually have to think of McHale very strongly in terms of the right-hand side of this image, this whole world of the pop collage. And the sort of truth is, everything you can see in this image is actually coming from Mikhail. So the most famous installation of the most famous group responsible for producing the most famous image that will be the icon for pop art, all of that was produced by John Mikhail, who's the person that nobody talks about. Right? So everything you see in this image which is an image by Hamilton, but everything in the image comes from Mikhail. Here we are looking now sideways to see the food collage of Mikhail. You can see the projector which was showing Navy maneuvers. Another picture of the installation. You see a couple of men working on a wall, but there's Mikhail and Hamilton on the ladders. Terry Hamilton is handing up one of the art colleges to Magda Cordell, the partner of John Mikhail. They're now assembling this production. But everything they're putting into the installation is coming from Mikhail, who's come back from Yale to do the installation. They literally are fighting physically after this image is taken. Right? They cannot stand each other. They have to produce this thing on deadline. Here's the day of the opening, and you have John Mikhail there wearing the tie, Magda Cordell in the middle, and very young James Sterling, the architect. Sterling, you will never see him without a whiskey, one of the great drinkers of architecture. A book on architecture and alcohol would be an enormous multi-volume set, but surely Sterling would have a very special place. You can see, if you look at the background, you can see that there are loudspeakers and so on. You can even see an astronaut's body there. All of that stuff is coming from Mikhail. The wheels of Duchamp. Duchamp personally gave them to Mikhail when he went to see him in New York. All of the op art images and so on. Every single thing in this image is coming from Mikhail. One or two of the big movie things like Bobby the Robot are coming from Frank Cordell, the musician. Frank Cordell is the husband of Magda Cordell, but the three of them are living in a menage a trois in a single house in Cleveland Terrace. So it's kind of a complicated scene. I mean, Mikhail, Magda, and Frank are a single, a triple. This is Mikhail and Magda in the room of that house with the scrapboard up behind them of all the various images that they're working on. You can see it's a sort of a super staged kind of image, not a very relaxed image, but you see all the magazines that are on the floor. These are the magazines that he has brought back from Yale, and those are the magazines that become incredibly famous as the sort of source material for the production of the image of pop art. This is Mikhail on the left and Magda on the right, both of them operating as artists, and we see them actually here at the opening of an exhibition in which they were both, we're both seeing. At the same time, this is the kind of work that was being produced by Richard Hamilton. He was really obsessed with movement, and he was doing paintings of movement very inspired by time motion studies. And this is what Mikhail was doing at the same moment. These are so-called transistors, so they're representations of information technology. The key thing to note here is that Hamilton was working as a painter, and to some extent Hamilton was always and only ever a painter, whereas Mikhail was only ever working with collage. These are scraps of paper that have been glued to the page. Here's another so-called transistor, because he was obsessed with information. And information starts to be formed in these kinds of ways, a mixture of newspapers and so on. And then he produces a series of collage books, of which this is one of the collage books. And this collage book is one of the books exhibited in the 1954. And so you can see, as I turn the pages for you, the different parts of the book open differently. So not only is Palazzi producing collages, which is sort of super famous, less famous is the fact that Mikhail was producing collages at the same time. This is one of the most famous of those books, I think from 1954, from the time of the exhibition. This is all the little strips, depending on which strip you open. So again, and this is Mikhail looking at those collages, and you may recognize that's the image that's used in the 1956 This Is Tomorrow catalogue. What you see in the background is actually the collage show and the installation which was designed by Mikhail. In other words, if you're really interested in the question of collage, and you want to go back to 1954 and look at the independent group, you'll come up with only two figures who were obsessed with collage, which was Wigley and Palazzi, one of whom becomes famous as one of the great artists, one of whom super non-famous. Here is the invitation to the collage and object show. It is itself a collage and it's produced by John Wigley, not by Palazzi. And then the discussions within the independent group, which are the most famous, the discussions about the mass media and so on, are actually organized by Lawrence Alloway and John Wigley. This is the list of independent group meetings that they ran. There were two phases of meeting in the independent group. The first one was run by Rena Bannon and it was on technology, automobiles and so on. And the second one was on the mass media and advertising. So when people think, what was it that the independent group talked about, they think of advertising and mass media. And that's actually the conversation that Lawrence Alloway and his best friend John McHale were carrying out. So hopefully the more we are talking, the more you start to understand that McHale was enormously important in this dialogue. Here's an invitation to a musical evening by Frank Cordell, done by John McHale. You see there's a person there that has been made up out of machinery, but made up out of media machinery, and sort of information is passing through that person's head. At the same time, John McHale and Maggie Cordell were doing actual advertising. They had a contract with Revlon, the cosmetics company. So they were not just theorizing advertising, they were making their money from advertising, and that money was being used to support the independent group. Here are some of the very taking displays that they produced in shops. So again, they're not like saying abstractly, isn't mass media interesting? They're actually working with the media in that operation. He also is producing a kind of architecture. He's making these little model construction kits, which developed like this, which were all based on modules that could be played and changed with, and come out of the wall, or act as kind of screens. And these kind of flexible architectural systems were then published in French architectural magazines with text by Lawrence Alloway. So he's also operating in a kind of architectural way in the same moment that he starts to do these kinds of collage books. But it also does a series of collages of heads made up, you see in this case, made up of the food from the advertisements that you advertise. So you don't just eat the image, you become the image. So a series of these heads, which you can see are in which there's a vague sense of a human being, which is actually something like a machine organism, which is also something organic. This is a 1954 exhibition of John McHale collages in London. This is the actual catalogue. You can see there were 11 of these collage heads. They look like this. And then there starts to be more than one person in the image. And at first you say, okay, it's kind of like an adult and a child. But if you look into the adult is made up out of food and so on. And very quickly it becomes a pretty weird combination of food, technology, and so on. And then he will do this cover for the Architectural Review magazine, which is a human robot person made up out of car parts, computers, steaks. There's a huge piece of chocolate cake you can see down the bottom. The chocolate cake is like the main feature. This was a mock-up, the version he did trying to experiment and produce that kind of collage. This is him photographed with what he called his spare head. So he took one of his collage figures and he's treating his second head. And you see he kind of looks at it, and again you could say he's like a ventriloquist who's imagining what would be said by this head, but he's also, it's not clear if the spare head is in charge of him or he's in charge of the spare head. This spare head he constructed at Yale while he was an art student, out of beer cans. And so again it is itself an object made out of the technology of consumption. But the same pattern is then reproduced in his artwork. In the same year that he has this image, he produces this Tallymath image, in which you get a sort of human figure next to a sort of computer figure that's also treated as a kind of a human. That series evolves with more complexity. And so it's a kind of a dialogue between the human transformed by technology and technology turned into human. The line of the outside of the body is completely blurred. So in this world of the expanded, ever-consuming figure, there's no longer a clear line of inside and outside. Of course, we can compare this to the work of, this is actually a collage of Nigel Henderson, that very beautiful, I think, that was, as you can see on the left, part of the Patio Pavilion of 1956. There's also collage work, and this is also a Nigel Henderson collage, and you see in the top right is a man with an artificial hand. The group was obsessed with prosthetics. Again, now we're back to Palazzi. Palazzi collected these images of these artificial hands. And again, if you look in some of Palazzi's sketchbooks, like this one, you have that operation. Now we are with Palazzi, and you see it's a similar kind of head, a head being constructed out of technology. The image on the right is entirely made out of pieces of cars. So it's a human made out of cars. And these are coming from, I think that one was 1950. Of course, immediately you can tell the difference between the Palazzi and the Mikhail collage. Again, two Palazzi images. You can almost see on the left, in the middle of trying to figure out which date to get it. It's 1955 and 1952. And then you have this is a Mikhail image. So now you have not just one figure, you have multiple figures, and again you can no longer say that the human figure dominates over the technological figure. It's a sort of image of a confusion of identity and technology. The inside of these figures is very, very precise. The outer limits are very blurred. And that series evolves. It's all about the blur of the human figure. This one is made up out of architecture. I can't remember what this one is made up out of. But again, the sense of great clarity and precision on the inside of the figure being increasingly blurred on the outside. And that's what, of course, produces finally this image, and the series keeps going. And these are huge, by the way. This is more or less the same size as the image. The image is 4 or 5 feet in size. And you see in this image a kind of confusion of the very precise inside and the blurry outside. But the outside now becomes very abstract, almost like a diagram of the figure. And this increasingly happens. So from the sort of blood and guts of the spaghetti and the cake and the steak and all of that, emerges an increasingly kind of abstract figure. Sometimes the abstract figure is in contrast to a kind of dense collage of material. Here is an exhibition by Magda Cordell to show you what she was working on in the same years. Very, very intensely sort of super kind of turgid figures, all female, and Mikhail figures, all male. So it's really a cliche soap opera. Very, very big images, much appreciated at the time. A little bit in the tradition of Dubuffet and the art group. And here you have an exhibition in 1959, very important, in which there's a figure on the left. The top of the figure is coming from a sculpture by Palazzi. The middle of the figure is coming from one of the collages of Mikhail, and the bottom of the figure is one of the paintings of Magda Cordell. You can see the three of them are being exhibited there. And this is the inside of the catalogue showing some of the work, including one of the images that I showed you. Here are the three of them at the opening to that exhibition. So in this moment of time, in 1959, the three of them are understood to be equals being presented. In fact, it was John Mikhail and Magda Cordell who were invited to make this exhibit in Cambridge, and they suggested that also Palazzi be invited too. I'm not making the argument here that Mikhail and Cordell are just as much artists as Palazzi. Palazzi is undoubtedly fantastic and important artist, and it's not the argument I'm making for Mikhail and Cordell. I'm just making the argument that if you read Palazzi's work without taking into consideration the work that's being produced immediately beside it, you're not understanding what's going on at all. Of course, the colored slides the color has changed over time. But you see here is, on the left is Palazzi, one of Palazzi's figures, one of the telemath collages of Mikhail, and one of the paintings of Magda Cordell. And this is one of the ones that was on exhibit there. And this one. Yeah, and some of these images I think are this one I particularly like. think it's a piece of chocolate cake again there on the right, is what I was getting. But you sort of see that he's become more efficient in his ability to represent this confusion. So it's a bit more crisp as an artist. And he produces these figures that are sort of like Xerox's X-rays. Again, we're going chronologically. So this was also in the exhibition of 59. And they're also being exhibited together. For example, New Trends in British Art was being shown in Italy. And you see there that John Michele and Palazzi are, there are two Micheles and two Palazzis. They are side by side. They've been treated as equal representatives of what's interesting in the work of artists at that time. And the first issue of the magazine called Uppercase featured both John Michele and Guido Palazzi as the main figures. You see Michele in that photograph of his head and those construction works. You see also the collage works. You see some of his collages. This is an important exhibition of their work in publication. And this is the last exhibition that Magda Cordell and John Michele do before leaving for England. And in fact, they don't see this exhibition. They've already gone. And it's in that moment that we have to reconsider this image of 1957. So what happens is, and you see these images are not just in galleries. That's that same collage which was actually produced for the cover of a magazine, and this is another Michele collage produced by the cover for a different magazine. And that's the environment within which we have to think about this images. So I'll just go really fast because I'm sure you're getting tired. And this is to make a contrast. So this is the Michele collage produced in 1956 for the This Is Tomorrow show. But this is really the kind of work that Hamilton was doing at the time. This is an absolutely brilliant painting in which he makes a very, very subtle relationship between the figure of the car, the sexuality of the automobile, and the sexuality of the pin-up. You maybe don't see her clearly, but there is a kind of, since you did Playboy, there's a Playboy type figure emerging here. And so it's an incredibly subtle, very strategic, highly edited work, carefully analyzing the styling of cars, the styling of buildings, and the styling of women. So for this case, it's explicitly a kind of Playboy type figure, and she and the toaster and the car and the house are all subtly made to be part of a singular, and you notice that there is no division. It's not like collage where you get the abrupt lines between each of the images. Here there's a sort of subtle blurring of everything. Again, here one of the playmates, again a kind of confusion between her, the corner of the room, the floor, the object. Again, the car, the woman, the you know. And you have to say that Richard Hamilton only ever made one collage, which is this one of 1956. So when all the endless art historians refer to this great pioneering work of pop art, they never hesitate to say, why is it that this is the only one he ever did? Because of course he was more or less operating within a very specific intellectual framework being provided by Michele at that moment. And this is, you've got to look at the work of Hamilton. It's just totally interesting from this point of view. He's analysing the same thing. He's analysing the structure of the images by which we now organise our life and desires. And you see suddenly this of a completely different order. Famously, all of the elements of this collage come from magazines collected by John Michele. What seems to have happened is one of the images taken from the magazine provides the overall structure. There is a photograph of an interior in the advertisement which is used for the overall structure. Magda Cordell and Terry Hamilton, the partners of Richard Hamilton and Magda Cordell, sat there with a pair of scissors cutting out images from those magazines, handing them over to Hamilton, who was then positioning them within the image. Being a totally brilliant artist, he knew exactly how to be, was able to do it with a kind of precision and an ability that Michele would never be able to do. This image could in no way be produced, in my opinion, by Michele. This is in every way a Hamilton collage. But it's Hamilton using material and using concepts that are foreign to him for once in his life, and doing so explicitly when he hates Michele. And Michele, in the very same moment, does his own version of an advertisement. So actually there were two posters of the group two, because they couldn't agree. And Michele designed a poster that represented his attitude. And interestingly enough, Hamilton actually produced and printed the poster, sent it to Yale, for him to see. Again, in Hamilton you will find sometimes, in Palazzi, you will find sometimes work that reminds you of this. And this is a telegram sent by Peter Smithson, sent to sort of raise the possibility that there could be another exhibition about the interior that would follow This Is Tomorrow. And this is often used as, and it basically is often treated as the defining document in the definition of pop art. But again, this is coming afterwards and it's a kind of retroactive move. Again, if you look at Hamilton's paintings, you will see that some of the themes in that collage continue in the other work. Like this figure from the movies, she reappears in many, but again, you would never confuse this work for Mikhail. It starts to get more dense, and you start to get that same sensitivity to the interior. Again, I would say you don't find the sensitivity to the interior in Mikhail. So this is again the idea of visualizing the domestic interior in this kind of way is very much Hamilton. He keeps evolving into more sort of photo collage terms. Eventually, he actually makes a limited edition set of prints of this image. So this thing, which was never art, is turned into high art. He then even starts to use the computer to make, I think, not very good versions again of just what it is about today's homes that makes them so appealing. He does this one, and finally he does a kind of limited edition silkscreen print in color of the original show. And you see on the left the silkscreen, you see on the right the actual thing. So what happens is with Hamilton, and even here he produces again a limited edition set you can buy. He finds himself at a certain moment of his career making this image, which almost accidentally becomes one of the most famous images in the history of art. And the more famous it is, the more he refuses that he has been influenced in any way by Mikhail, because this is a threat to his newfound glory. And he eventually starts to reproduce this image and monumentalize it. And he has a particularly strong fantasy about how that image is produced. A fantasy that is easy to dismiss. And I spent quite a lot of time talking to him about the construction of his image. And basically it all comes down to the fact that he just hates the fact that some people might possibly think that Mikhail is music. And it's still, to this day, he's still burning with the anger of that moment. So why am I telling you all this? I'm just saying that in the same way that when we looked at the Rem Koolhaas Casa Musica, you could see that it was an incredibly sustained reflection on the nature of the interior. And maybe we could have the lights. Yes. And some oxygen somehow. Can they also let us know? Maybe we can open the door. I mean, it might be interesting to have the conversation without oxygen, just like So my argument is sort of very simple, that the experimental conversation that led to the concept of pop art was a sustained reflection on the nature of the interior in a world of mass media imagery. That was the project. Every now and then artists produced images that show you graphically what the nature of that was. That was not just a transformation of the interior, it was also a transformation of the human body, of subjectivity, of sexuality, of desire, of economics, of information, and so on. In other words, it's a massive transformation. In some ways, when we have this conversation about what's going on with Facebook and so on, we are in the same mode trying to imagine what would be the space of this media. Part of, I think, the point that Beatriz and I are trying to make is much more of the radical transformation of subjectivity that you associate with the internet and computer and so on. Much more of that transformation had already occurred in the immediate post-war period. It was already understood to be exactly in that way. So when we speak about globalization, deterritorialization, and so on, a lot of that is being thought about very, very deeply in the period of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. in architecture there's an enormous discourse about what will be computer architecture, long before architects were ever allowed to use a computer. By the way, architects were the very last species to be allowed to use a computer. It was handed down from the military to aerospace to big engineering firms to and it finally got to architects. And when we got finally the computer in our hands, we said, revolution, computer architecture. In the 1980s, like in the late 80s, when actually the main thinking about the transformation caused by the computer was happening in the 1960s, and many architects had already visualized the consequences of that. So when we want to think about something like Instagram and try to understand it, there's some value in going back and just trying to remember what was the transformation of the image that occurred in the 50s and 60s, which already detached the image from a simple understanding of the image and the world of the spectators and reception. And you already get there. Remember, 1964, Marshall McLuhan was writing about the extension of the human nervous system to the size of the entire planet, the global village and all of that. And that's arguments that he has already formulated in 1959, and arguments anyway he stole from Buckminster Fuller, who wrote about them in the 1930s. So already in the 1960s, the radical space of kind of global expansion of technology and this prosthetic expansion of human consciousness, this was already theorized in the 1930s, became uber famous in the 1960s, such that when we talk about Instagram today, we need to kind of have that in mind. The purpose of saying this is not to say, well, it's all been said before, but actually, in a certain sense, what's interesting to note is artwork came out of this. New forms of writing came out of this. New forms of architectural production. New forms of sensitivity. These people, Bannon was simply the most influential writer in architecture in the post-war period, I think. Arguably, Richard Hamilton was one of the key figures of the English art world. That's also true of Palazzi. Ellison and Peter Smithson are still revered as the great thinkers. You know, there are other great thinkers as well, but the great thinkers. So out of this period, out of this group, came astonishing production. And likewise, we have every reason to imagine that the continued transformation of the nature of the image and the nature of information itself and the nature of subjectivity will lead to whole new forms of production. And I know we've said that this theory class doesn't like give you the theory and then you run off to studio, like you don't talk about Instagram and then I'm hooked on the Instagram thing. We don't like talk about Instagram and then run to the studio and become suddenly, you know, Insta whatever. But at some level, if you think seriously about Instagram, you might well be able to think more seriously about any situation you find yourself in as a designer. Because basically it's a way of being less stupid. And we want to finish with that because Cedric Price is from Palace. I got to talk to him a lot about what he was thinking about when he produced that project. And he produced all sorts of charts to show that people who like chocolate also like exercise and these kinds of things. And I said, why did you do this? And he said, to reduce the level of my stupidity. I think there's a powerfully important role to play. It's like to reduce stupidity. So the point about looking back at this history is just to say, look, this enables us to see that if you think seriously about something, you can open up a space, and in that space you can do something unexpected. And that's what we mean, I think, by the theory is never giving you a one-to-one explanation of what you could or should not do in design. Even if theory looks like that, that's not what it does. But what it can do is create a different space for design, but it doesn't even say what that space is. It just almost by accident, very strong theoretical arguments transform the space of production in unpredictable ways, leading you to produce work that doesn't simply manufacture an image of what that theory was asking for. Perhaps the work you produce is a kind of counter-reaction. Maybe the purpose of very good theory is to produce very, very good design as a kind of challenge to that theory, which causes a new theory and so on and so on. Anyway, I'm joined by my partner, Graham. Part number 2. You have the list of the ones?
No, I think you make a list today.
But while we're setting up any kind of questions, this was a military attack on you. You know, for an hour and a half. You can watch us drink water. So in the previous moment, who was at the halfway point? Okay.
We were more or less here. But you are first here?
Yeah.
Okay. No, I didn't know the list. I mean, this is a new list. Okay, your name.
Also, revert back to the idea of the internet, but Adam.
What's the color of your pen? Black. And your
Like
name?
around the last third of the page.
The last? What's the name?
Adam, E-D-H-A-N.
We got it.
Yeah.
Ah.
Okay, so I'll go back to the idea of the internet, but I'm more interested in the internet as we use it rather than as we think about it, because like we tend to think theoretically about the internet as one thing, while actually I believe that the internet does exist in like a multiplicity of ways. For example, like the internet that we talk about is definitely different from like a Chinese person's idea of the internet.
Right.
And like I remember like about 3 years ago I was in China trying to explain Facebook to like a Chinese person, and I remember like she had difficulty trying to understand what's the difference between Facebook and regular email. So there are definitely multiplicity of understanding of what internet is and what social networking is, and even in the sort of like this one understanding of like internet, I believe there are also multiplicity. For example, there are like a Russian version of Facebook that is only available in Russian. So it's sort of like a localized version of.
And what do you think that would mean for the interior?
I would say like the one global network that connect us all is not actually.
It's not a good image for what's going on.
Yeah, it's not actually connecting us all. It's sort of like it has also its sort of like regional versions.
Right.
That sort of like intensifies the regionality and the locality of like.
So that makes sense, right? The internet is not one big shared space that is actually super subdivided into different territories, but also different ways of understanding the same territory.
Yeah. So there is territories within this network. It's not sort of like this horizontal thing.
Police strategy.
Right.
Policing of that territory in different parts of the.
Right.
It's a network, right?
It is a network, but a territorialized network. Like no, territorialized. Like there is parts of the network that is accessible only for the military, that is accessible only for the Russians.
So it depends on like vantage point, right?
Depends on, I would say, first accessibility, because we have to remember also the internet is a military project. So
Yeah, but that's thinking about, not using it, right?
well, like it's using it. Like we are not like globally, we're not allowed to use like more than almost half of the bandwidth of the internet available.
Right. So I mean, the general image of the internet is that now have access to all these things you didn't have access to before.
Yeah, exactly.
But it would be a mistake to assume that we now have more access than before, in the sense that it might be that there are more things we don't have access to now than before.
Is that what you're saying?
There's something different way of saying that. You know what I mean, right? That there are more things that can be put onto the internet and kept away from me now
Yeah,
than
so
there were before.
anyway, and I would say also like it would, in a way, because like if I share things with like if I'm Russian and I'm sharing things with my Russian friends, this would develop a sort of like a very particular Russian understanding of these things, which would sort of intensify our Russianness in a way.
So, for example, if I'm living in a small village in a medieval time, how big is my world? Right? And I might think that there are parts of the world that I don't have access to because I'm from the wrong social class, or the wrong gender, or the wrong, play for the wrong team, or whatever. But the relationship between what I get access to and what I don't have access to might not be very different from that ratio today. In other words, today I think I've got the whole world at my fingertips, but there is an even bigger world.
But
It's
we're
not
sharing
at my
the same
fingertips. And the relationship between what I can see and what I can't see might be similar to what it was before. There's no reason to think that we are, let's say, more privileged, that the world is more available to us now. Even though, of course, I can watch what's happening on the other side of the moon now. Right? That doesn't mean necessarily that my position in the world is more knowing than that
So the
time.
guy in my place 1,000 years ago, but relatively.
Yeah.
What do you say?
Like my position now in the universe, like absolutely could be bigger. Like I could understand things or could have access to things that like a person in my place wouldn't have
Right.
in like 100 years ago.
Yeah.
But relatively, we almost like have the same ratio of access.
Because we don't have access to real power still, right?
We don't have access to it?
To real power.
Real
To
power.
real power.
But it looks like this internet space that's about freedom is somehow assuming
Highly precise and
of like
But it's
actual
more, I think,
divisions, physical divisions in the graph.
it's more like freedom, like free beer, not freedom like being free. You know?
Well, in a way, like for example, in China, in China, it's highly politicized. Like the government decides what to see, what not to see. But for example, in Russia, I think it's like a very genuine
But
choice
who
by
decides
the
in
Russians.
USA?
I think for Russia, what do you think?
Yeah, what do you think?
Exactly. What are the Russians thinking?
The Russians.
No comment.
Maybe Mariana.
They have good contact, they're all good.
It's not like it's somebody available in Russia. I mean,
I have good contact.
And
It's awesome, you can listen to free music. You know?
no people. No people therefore.
So it's just something to think about. In the medieval time, the universe ended. There was an imaginary dome, right? And the stars were like in the
Ceiling.
of this dome. So for us, it looks like we lived in a small world, but it's ridiculous to imagine that we live in a bigger world than they did. And it would be ridiculous not to think that 2,000 years from now, people will look at our perception of the universe and say, what a bunch of losers. I mean, they really, yeah. Also, there's the internal world. Right? Mikhail, that we were talking about, was very interested in the prosthetic expansion of knowledge into the full electromagnetic spectrum. In other words, he was interested in the fact that we can now see things that are not visible through infrared and so on, but also that you can see deep into at the atomic level, but also you can see deeper into history. And eventually he argued that we could see deeper into the future. So it was a kind of super expanded idea of subjectivity.
How would you see into the future? What was his mechanism for seeing?
Well, he became a futurist, and so they argued that they could predict, based on current data, what would be the next thing that would happen.
Scientifically or business?
Well, they would think of it scientifically. He wrote a book called The Future of the Future, which he argued that the future is. There's this has a great title, The Future is Not What It Used to Be. That's it.
That's what we have done.
Yeah. Okay, who's next?
I see over here to the mission
I found something interesting that you said, because when you speak about, you said that we can do something.
Yeah.
I kind of feel that like, yeah, the size of the world is the same, but we kind of lose our identity in a way. We're more connected to things, but we're more sort of dependent on the infrastructure
Yeah.
in a way, so we have access to information which is on the other side of the dark side of the moon. But I'm sort of dependent on the satellites and that sort of thing, and so on and so forth. So I think there's a question of identity, which is sort of giving up for this perception of you have access to more things.
Right. So, for example, Arab Spring is often associated with the power of social media through Facebook to enable unofficial groups to mobilize at a very large scale, at a very large scale over a very long period of time. So Facebook, social media seem to mobilize revolutionary struggle by a horizontal layer of people suffering in a vertical environment. But Facebook is also the single biggest monopoly in the history of the planet, where all of the private information of all those people is owned by a teenager, more or less, a permanent teenager. who successfully ripped off his friends of this idea. So Arab Spring is simultaneously an incredibly good image of the transformative social potential of social media, but it's also an incredibly good image of the fact that we are still controlled by the man, that computers is just the latest form of domination of individuals by massive high-level interests. Right? So we've no reason to rate ourselves free relative to any moment of the past. Right? So that's, I think many people talk about the internet, they just immediately speak about more information, more speed, more potential. It's all plus. But any of us who use these computers know, like, it doesn't matter how many versions of Windows you have, you still are more or less accomplishing the same number of things. It's actually astonishingly how little gets added rather than how much gets added.
It's always obsolete the moment you buy it.
Right.
Of course. Okay, who's next?
You?
Yeah.
Your first year?
Sorry?
Your first year too, right? First year.
First year.
Yeah. And your name?
Sitnikov. It should be.
There it is, at the very bottom.
Oh, okay. So,
Right there.
here you go.
There should be a coolness, name coolness rating. Yeah.
So I'm thinking that everybody's talking about Facebook, but it seems to me that Facebook is a website, of course, of a gigantic scale, but still it is much more for leisure, for fun, and so people are not so serious about using it. But there is such a thing as internet banking, and this is very important. Especially, you were talking about the last 5 years, and what happened is financial crisis. And I guess, like, up today, a lot of people using internet banking. And maybe this somehow connected to it, because banks are today in everybody's bedrooms.
Yeah.
You just open your laptop and you're already calculating your finances. And the only border that separates you from your money and everybody else from your money is 20 digits that you enter. And that's it. Information and 20 letters. And this is the security. It's not, it doesn't feel secure. So you're at, like, in medieval time, people kept their gold. I guess there was no bank. They kept it in the bank somewhere where they sleep. And today's money came back there, but in a digital form.
Yeah.
And like that sense of insecurity came back with this computer and internet and internet banking, I guess.
Okay, so this is good argument. Anyone add anything more to it? The bank, of course, again, all these things.
And what the point is that if we're talking about interiority, and how did it change for the last 5 years? I guess it became more secure, and
More
people,
secure.
yeah, maybe it's just my opinion, but I guess that people feel not so secure within, particularly like last year's at their house.
Right.
I think it's super interesting. I mean, you know, if you think of the traditional bank, the great trick of the bank is that it doesn't have the money. I mean, you give them the money, and then they use the money to make more money. So actually, your money is not there anymore. So the way they classically deal with that dilemma is use a lot of architecture. So banks look big and important and strong, but mainly what that is an image of security, which replaces the fact that actually if you were to go and ask for money, we all ask for money, the bank collapses. So the sense of security was coming from the architecture. So there is this question in the age of internet banking, where is the image of security? What is the architecture of security that replaces that? And of course there is some of the language of security, like the key, the lock, the vault, the box, you know, like all of that.
In the actual market. But in the internet banking, what is it that gives you the security? The password, the fact that they sometimes give you emails telling you that to protect yourself you should do this and that, and the password has particular rules, etc. But you know that that's not really very.
Actually, most of the banks use a different domain of the internet. Like we use a space of the internet, and they use a different space.
Right. But you are totally vulnerable. And you are totally vulnerable when you are doing internet banking, anything for
like it's not like accessible to the same sort of like, it's not in the same room as Facebook.
Doesn't that make you feel even more insecure?
But also, I think the money doesn't exist really.
No.
I mean, they could just add it up and nobody would lose. In fact, like $1 million now.
Yeah.
If you lose this, you just would have.
Yeah. So I think it's I think it's a really good point you're making that should be thought about, that that money is flowing at a speed, and also the timing. The transactions are now down to microseconds. So the speed of money has changed, and the movement of money has changed. And then there is this issue of where is the feeling of security? And you said, I think very beautifully, the bank is in your bedroom. But in which form? And as Beatriz is saying, you are enormously vulnerable to identity theft. I mean, the proportion of internet crime is massive. And they tell us about some of it, they didn't tell us about all of it, because if they told us about all of it, the like banks, we would stop using those systems. So we make a trade-off between the ease with which we can buy things and the risks. We make the same trade-off that we use the internet, even though the internet watches every single site we visit. Right? So there's a famous story of people who looked up a hotel to go for a vacation. Yeah, I mean, I didn't mean it's not true. It's a famous true story. And they look up the site to go to vacation, possible vacation. Then when they go for their health insurance, the premiums are high, because statistically, the people who are going to that hotel are having certain kinds of.
So that part of the world may have more serious health problems, so their insurance has gone up. Right? So there is a connection between the things that you do internet and the other aspects of their life.
So again, where is privacy when no matter what you're looking at, someone else is looking at you looking, and then sending you back advertisements based on what you've been looking at, but also making strategic decisions. It is said that Obama won the election because he was able to make those analyses. People who buy a certain kind of book are likely to give money to the Democrats if you give them a phone call. People who buy another kind of book will give money if you send a message saying that your friends have given money. Certain kinds of people will give money if you say you get to have an evening with a beautiful person. So they found a beautiful person on the west, I think it was George Clooney in Los Angeles. All the women wanted to have an evening with George Clooney, so like 1,000 women turned up. It was a big room. They had all given, and they had figured out that they would do this. Then they had to find a woman on the East Coast. I think it was Jennifer Aniston or something like that. They figured out which would be the person who everybody would say, yes, I'll have an evening with that person. Spend $10,000 for that. So there is this general question, what do we mean by privacy? And if you're an architect making a private space, in which way might you think about that differently? Like if the bank is in your bedroom, the bedroom is not what it used to be.
There's another currency, that's likes and shares.
Yeah.
There is no better PR and advertising than that. And gathering statistics and everything, so.
Yeah.
Okay, next first year that we have.
Sort of going around.
No, we have done some.
Yeah, you did this right.
Yeah, we did. Did you?
Yes. No.
No. That's what I thought.
What would you like to answer me?
I'm thinking about the cigarette.
The cigarette?
Yes. You know,
Obviously.
Nothing.
but not only for the smokers, it involves other products in terms of interiors. As you know, most of the cigarettes prefer to smoke in the outside state, but when they are home, in the apartment, so they prefer to open the window or go to the bathroom, even when the weather is cold. lights in front of them, which is acceptable with cigarette. If you don't have a cigarette and just watching a lot of windows in front of you, it's weird. For example, in case of mine, I have a woman in my neighborhood. I just see her when I open the window and I smoke a cigarette. It's kind of, I think, making closer myself to her privacy, or so I think
it's kind of interesting, right? Because smoking, which usually people prefer to be outside, and in fact they were forced outside, before people were outside, they used to smoke everywhere, in class, now you used to be full of smoke, library, everywhere, right? And now people that smoke are forced outside, but it's interesting that you see it as preferred. But one thing that developed out of this is that kind of, again, the social level, so the occupation of public space by a group of smokers in all schools outside and all the buildings which connect with each other, so it's another social space. So what I like very much is the idea of the window, because that's also in relation to what we were talking about with the internet before, is similar to what happens when you are online and there are other people that are online simultaneously, but it's physical, right? And it's too and the smoke that you see the window, which is the traditional interface, as opposed to the interface of the computer, the more contemporary interface. So after all this discussion of internet, we talk about other space, which is the space of the smoker and the relationship with inside or outside the window and the space outside of our building.
Yeah, this is a good example. There's also a tradition of making space with the cigarette. Right? Yes. So it's not so much about bringing the smoke into you, but putting the smoke out
in an atmosphere.
In space.
Yeah.
So you kind of architecture, it's like a portable.
So what's your name again? Here, in blue.
Yes.
In blue. Not Penguin, right? Here.
Okay, who's next?
It's not just physical space, I think it also allows you certain pause to give you emotional.
Yes.
It's not just like I think it's the same type of intoxication.
Okay, that's
intoxication.
Okay, now we're to good subject. Yeah, exactly. I mean, to drink is to change the limits of your body and your mind, right? That's the nature. But this starts already with as you know, I know myself if I don't drink coffee, so something from the outside is used to produce my inside. So again, I think smokers feel like if they cannot smoke, they cannot be themselves. It's like the identity is not just a habit. So I think it's very, very interesting. And, we can also raise the question of whether architecture has the same role of intoxicating the thing. That I can't be myself when I say in my room.
Mind altering? They're all mind altering substances.
Yeah.
The adulteration, which has something gets that self you want to be out with.
It was a very serious subject in architecture in the 60s. There were articles in professional magazines that said, is LSD good for design?
Yeah, and there's also schools as well.
So
right. And when it was possible to smoke inside buildings, I mean, people felt like if I didn't have a cigarette in I mean, actually, the figure of the architect was the pipe is very difficult. So that generation felt like without a pipe, they couldn't be designed, and that's why you see them more in these photographs. Still in the photographs I was showing today of the 50s, they still with their pipe, because it's also a form of the change, nicotine change the way to see it in your cafe. Alcohol is a form of intoxication.
But the general question is architecture a mind-altering substance?
Yes,
Is that what you're thinking about?
of course.
If you listen to architects, it is. It is that you change the way people see their world.
No, if you see if you talk to people that torture, they will tell you that. In Spain, in the years of Franco, there were cells for detention that produce hallucination. So it's not just hallucination with sounds and other things, but hallucination actually with the architecture, by altering the space, by using kind of psychedelic patterns and altering perspective of space, they turn people mad, totally mad, right? And I'm sure space is used in ways other than just confinement, which is of course absolutely maddening and has been used in centuries, but there are even more sophisticated ways of using architecture as a form of torture. So architecture definitely can have that effect, and it's not known only to the architects, but it's known to it can be used in a positive way, and it can be used in a very
means threat.
right.
Well, the stable architecture, well known in psychological warfare.
I think I've already
Yours, already half that.
Okay, what's your name?
other
Okay, what's the
I
color
think
of your
already
hair?
defined it.
What?
You already marked this in the previous time.
Ah, okay, you're saying something, okay.
Yes. I was referring to how I was traveling, and the only point when I was really lost was when my phone's battery died.
No, you said my
battery died. And basically the positioning of GPS in every phone nowadays, I mean, I think the next generation will never know what it's like to be lost.
Right.
And I mean, I was traveling through cities, and I had marked certain buildings in the map, and the way to those buildings became almost meaningless. It was like one room after another room and another room and another room. No passages in between. I think that has really affected the way we create cities and continue to come.
So many people that cannot read it anymore than it's in our map, they have to be told, make a right, make a left, make a right. Even taxi drivers don't know what they are.
And you can choose the gender of the voice, right? Right? Some people prefer to have a woman tell them turn
What
right.
to do.
And for others it's like, no. So it's a very psychological, this thing of the machine as your friend, as your guide. It means also you're not lonely if you're with your friend. So basically when the battery went out, it's not just that you can't find your way, you lost your best friend. This thing that talks to you and tells you where to go and what to do, to warm.
Okay, next. Okay, Mark, do you have to do? Okay, it's orange, right?
Yes.
Okay.
What I would like to say is that coming from a very different social and cultural background, I would say like there was a lot of a sense of belonging when you come into an interior space, and it kind of varies based on climate and other factors as well. But since the media has come in, yes, I agree that we tend to move towards media and towards all these gadgets and things like that. But I don't like, I still feel like an interior space is something which is supposed to be more comfortable. When you come inside, like you really get a sense of shelter, but you don't see that so much now. It seems to be disappearing, the relationship between an outside and an inside. So, yeah, with the media being in existence, what would the next interior be? That's what I think.
Yeah, that's the
Sounds
question.
good.
Yeah.
So, I don't know. It's just, this is making me think forward to it. So.
Yeah, it's making me think.
I mean, I think, of course, this is the question we're asking you all to.
Yeah, and we ourselves are thinking about it. It's not like it's obvious. There's not any obvious answer to all the things. It's not that we are either in possession of any truth. There is no truth about this. There's such a new reality that we are ourselves, I think, thinking about it. Because I'm sure it affects, it will affect architecture, it will affect the way in which we think about architecture. Because architecture is always about this, what is inside and what is outside of the public, and it is private.
So it could be be that the responsibility of the architect is to think about it. The job of the architect is to think about interior. The interior is not something that's made. I have found that's something that's made.
I don't have an answer for that right now.
No, but you suggest very interesting things, because this thing of this sense of belonging that you describe when entering a traditional interior in a traditional location, it has maybe its parallels in internet life, right? You feel more comfortable when you enter into the space of a friend, when you are on Facebook, when you are connecting with friends. Is there a relationship between that sense of familiarity?
There is, but
belonging to a community in the internet is parallel, is comparable to the one that you felt when you enter into an interior in a traditional society?
And again, like, you're only connected by, you're just wired to a specific, you're just connected. But it really doesn't give you this clear feeling of being with the person.
There's no new condition called iPod oblivion. It is causing like 40 deaths per year. Something like that. It's called iPod oblivion. It's the state when you listen to music in the street, you get smashed by cars. So it's like it's becoming a thing. It's being developed in the last 5 years or so.
Yeah.
More and more people are getting killed because of their like interior desire to be cut off from
They are in another space and they don't like the land.
Yeah.
I mean, before it was the Walkman or whatever, right? So there was also this.
But this is really, I think, now getting, because every other person has like
the most unbelievable thing is when they pass you in their bicycle at high speeds and they have this and they are not even on and they are not even aware of other traffic or other cars that are screaming at them or whatever. So that's incredible. But this also reminds me of the time that I arrived in New York, which was early 80s, and at the time Sony had introduced this very small, very sleek Walkman. And I was very impressed by the fact that the subway, I come from Spain, so I've never seen the subway like in New York, absolutely crowded. How people used to defend themselves against that invasion of privacy by putting their headphones in and kind of creating a space for themselves in conditions in which they are kind of face to face press against other people. But they feel like they are on their own kind of space, and that's actually how everybody was handling depression, which also reminds me of what Simmel says, Simmel is a sociologist at the beginning of the 20th century, writing about the metropolis and the life of the intellectual life of the inhabitant, who is also concerned about that, and he talks about how never before in history, he's reflecting on that, the same way that we are now reflecting on the reality of the internet. Never before in history, Simmel says that there have been so many people forced to stand next to each other, not knowing them at all before. Right? And how do you protect yourself in those conditions? That was a question for sociologists and philosophers at the beginning of the century. And he reflected on the way in which in those conditions, particularly in public transportation and so, people didn't look into the eyes of other people. So you avert your eyes as a way of creating, again, without the help of anything, a space for yourself, a private space in which you can protect your privacy. So again, going back to the Robin Evans article, privacy is not anymore about walls that separate you from other people, but about ways in which you can create a space for yourself, where the eyes are very important. Whether you look or you don't look into the eyes of other people, that's a very particular way of protecting your kind of intimacy. You are an author too, or you create with the help of technology even a more bubble.
What you think though is the way I'm doing a small research on this, I'm thinking of the difference between what you're saying now. I see what's the difference between a physical and a virtual space as well. And what I came as a conclusion was, what you're saying right now, my conclusion is that you're blocking all your senses, gives you some more privacy. So if we think about a virtual space, you sitting behind your PC at home, in comparison with having a live conversation with someone, you feel more safe because all you have there is either chatting or like talking, but you're blocking some of your senses. So not using all of your 5 senses is giving you some privacy and some safety, let's say.
Yes.
So I don't know. I thought of it as how does privacy is linked with your senses.
Yes.
And how you can use that actually in architecture. So how to create a more virtual space which is going towards physical space. So when you have, let's say, so now me and you, we have a conversation, we're in the same room. It's the timing is perfect. So I mean, you don't write and then it comes like after a bit. So by adding or subtracting senses, I think that gives more virtual and more physical. I don't know if you know what I mean.
Yes, I do. And of course, in all those conditions that we were describing, you have to also consider all the kind of potential invasion of privacy that represents to be in contact with the skin of other people that you don't know. One thing is to be present against a lot of people in a subway, and another thing somebody is actually touching you deliberately. Right? That's an invasion of privacy. But this is also kind of potentially an invasion of privacy. And it's curious that in terms of security, because we can talk about security in the internet, security this and that, in New York and in the subway when I arrived to, I was struck by the fact that they were actually giving advice of not looking at people in the eye, because people in New York are coming from all over the world, right? And they may think that it's okay to just stare at somebody, but that's somebody that you're staring and you are entering into a relationship in which you don't intend to. And that can be violent. That can be not to your advantage. You maybe think that it's okay to just check, but the other person may be thinking that you're looking this way or the other way, and you know, and you can create an incredible situation where if you are, so people protect themselves from reading, listening to this, and definitely not making. Like condom is part of the social contract, I suppose, that people in other cultures didn't have. They would go to the street, and of course, somebody comes around with blue hair, of course you look at them, right? But you see, one of the things that struck me when I was a kid and I started going to London, is nobody cared. You know, you could, you know, I was in Spain, and if I've seen the people that I was seeing going down the street in London, of course everybody will look at them, right? But you could go into a pub, and there were all these, you know, crazy kind of fun people with all kind of color hair, and there's all these old ladies here having a beer, and they enter into a conversation like nothing is happening, like completely different
So you're touching something there with this iPod thing. Personally also, following on those thoughts that of course I reach out into the internet cloud to take a piece of music that maybe 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10 million other people are also reaching out to. But I take that from this super public space of the cloud, I put it in my iPod in order that I can disconnect myself from it. So I reach to this big outside in order to have no contact with the outside. So I build up my private space with this music that comes from another place, another time, another ecology, maybe another nation, another language, in order to create my own space, which is, as you say, so sealed off from the world that I think we killed.
Now also there's this Google Glass button, which is like augmented reality glasses that will maybe become
They will go around with these things.
We're either going to go fast or we're going to run out.
Yeah, no, we have to go fast, no? I mean,
2 minutes, we got 2 minutes to go.
Where do you sign this?
This is the most difficult thing to
What color? What color?
Blue.
Blue, where? Red? No.
That's
Okay, so
maybe this one screen replace the window and maybe one digital pressure.
Yeah.
Okay, good. The point is pick up each of the final ones and have one big wrap up, otherwise we'll never go. Yeah.
Pink.
Pink. You guys are really well. Orange and pink. So Second Life like a whole, not just the internet as a world, but a specific world constructed in the internet as a full world. All the elements.
Is that still going on? Is it more? A lot of people are following it still?
I think so. Not like it used to be.
You did not talk
Not like that.
there used to be OMA, Second Life, and all these forums. They find out they have to come. They still are. Yeah, I haven't seen them.
It was big 5 years ago.
Yeah, it was big 5 years ago. Is that picking up again?
that's the other thing.
So it's not fake.
Yeah,
it's
it's
real.
I'm trying to fake it, but that's what makes it. It's also,
Okay.
it's also with the media, not just Facebook or something, because like in Bombay we have now 200 news channels and all of them are 80% advertisements, 10% weather, and all of the news really not existent. And
Yeah.
always, they always show what we want to see.
Yeah.
Might never be in the news, like for example, we had 2 years ago, we had a huge national event of a 4-year-old boy falling into a hole, and he was in that hole for a whole week, and all the news channels showed this live for a whole week. Just a picture, video, of the boy outside, and something listed. This is all the whole country saw for a whole week. And we never need to see that.
Okay.
Okay, next one.
My name is Staedelschule.
Theodora.
Theodora, yeah.
For me, it's video game, like
Video games, yeah.
like Sims,
yeah.
the opportunity to people to learn how to design, like how to design their house, or how to design their identity, or how to design their face.
Okay, that's interesting. Okay, so if we say that what's happening with the interior, because architects have a responsibility for the interior, you're saying actually people can become architects in this. Okay.
My name is Maria, and I think my name is not there.
It's still not there. Don't exist on the database. Put it in the prison cell, by the way.
I would only say Occupy movement. It's a world political situation all over the world that's happening in the last several years, and it's like so global and quite local at the same time. And I think that's something that actually drags us out of this computer world of the internet, and of course all the movements are using very actively. But still, it's going back to the street, going back to the physical space, interacting with people face to face. And I think that's good.
So super interesting. A good example, because occupy also, you can only occupy in I can only occupy an interior. I don't know, maybe it's a question, can I occupy the desert? I can occupy the desert if I somehow make it an interior. That's, of course, the people who live in the desert, what's interesting is it's all domesticated. They are in that like we are in a house. It is a house. So Occupy movement is very much about interior, but you say, interestingly, it's almost going in the opposite direction to the... And yet you could use Facebook to agree to occupy.
Yeah, they did. That's how they operate.
Yeah, that's how they...
So people and machines need to get it.
Yes. Occupying the streets.
Yeah, but it's like using social networks as an instrument to go back to the physical.
To preset. Yes. Okay.
Wonderful. Next one.
Curtis.
You already spoke, no? This morning. No?
Yeah, I did.
You want to do what? You have another one?
I cover, or we can just move on?
No,
you choose. Free man.
Okay, this one's a bit more anecdotal. This one's a bit more anecdotal, so I'll just say it quickly because it kind of relates to technology, but also a different way of thinking about interiority. Interiority is like this idea of public and private, and maybe people who are displaced, so homeless, whether it's because of economic or social or political reasons. There was a company last year that looked at the distribution of homeless in the downtown core of Boston City. And then during the summer, they outfitted these homeless individuals and turned them into wireless hotspots. And so instead of having to go inside to access the internet, you could find one of these people. And they're not always easy to recognize, but it was just a different way of accessing this interior digital world through somebody who is been displaced from physical interior for whatever reason.
Yeah, I know. I read that story.
It was kind of
That's a great example. I mean, when I try to connect to and here it said Mensa.
Yeah.
So I know it's over there. Since I don't have the password for Mensa, I can't be in Mensa. So I'm aware of the fact that Mensa is an interior, which is that room over there, but it's also a Wi-Fi zone, which I don't have, I cannot access. Right? So Wi-Fi kind of hotspots. you listen to what we've been saying so far, they would be all of them kind of domestic interiors. So they could want to be in, heavy to be in. And in those interiors there are security issues. What you share, who you share with, etc.
Okay,
My name is Carolina.
Carolina next.
I think like last 5 years it's not about the media appeared because it exists also before, but it's about the development of the technology. Because before we also had the computer at station 1 at the home, we had the TV, but we have the phone at home. But the development changed. It disconnected us from the home, from the space we are living. Because we are creating our own space now with the computer, we have the laptop, we have the smartphone, and we are creating like the bubble. Before the bubble was our apartment, now the bubble we are creating and we are taking it with us, whatever the outside. And also the Facebook, it appeared like it was 5 years. And it changed the communication in the inside apartment, because when I was, for example, waiting for my friend in Denmark, it happened to me. First night she wrote me from another room if I want a coffee on the Facebook. And I was like, okay, come on. And it's disappearing. It's seriously happening. Like I see, like every day you see, like people sitting with the computer in front of each other, actually writing on the Facebook is about communication. So I think that's what's changed in the interior, that people communicate normally without using the internet.
Okay, good. Anybody we are missing? Anybody?
Yeah. Tim Black.
Martin, yeah.
Got you. No, it's got you. Yeah. For us, it's a major intellectual exercise.
I was thinking about the ecological development, especially in Germany. It's called Passivhaus standard. I can't translate it in English. That means that the surroundings closed. There's automatically air conditioning, and you as an inhabitant into the house you can't breathe. That's my thesis. And if you look into the future, you get what can you say? It's a preparation of living in another space, you know, because you get dance into this house, and this density affected you as a person, and in the future maybe we're living like this, and that's what I'm thinking.
It's a great example, right? You understand more or less? So if you have like a super carbon neutral house that's not giving or taking anything from the environment, it's like the iPod thing, it's completely sealed. You're saying sealed in a sense it's a little bit claustrophobic, but let's say it's more of an interior because it doesn't participate in the outside other than solar energy and so on. It's interesting the last thing you said, because in the 1960s there was a huge obsession in architecture with life in outer space and the technologies that would make that happen. John McHale, we talked about, devoted a lot of, reproduced many of the diagrams of NASA of these systems which would allow the astronaut to survive in outer space. And those systems, the inside of the body and the inside of the space capsule are the same thing. So actually the space house is part of her body. So it was a complete blurring of the body and the technology. And there were fantastic examples in London, this group, the street farmers. The student of Beatriz study where they put this into motion. So for example, if you shit in the house, of course you need to use that shit for energy. So you have a house in which the shit is never leaving, and you have to grow your food in it because
they were at the area and they managed to get funds to build it in the middle of London, and there he is, this guy, the street farmer guy, and with his family and 2 kids and another guy living in this demonstration house in which everything has to be extremely calculated, and all the input and output of the house is precisely calculated so that they are not taking anything from the environment. And the problem developed when he had some family emergency and had to go and see his mother somewhere because he And then he put a student of his in the house, because you have to have a number of people that are producing enough seed and urine and everything, so that the whole thing, I mean, unbelievable. And this guy got the flu and was given some medication, and he should never have done that, because then of course the whole thing killed the whole economy. The penicillin killed the whole system. By taking back the whole thing had been.
But I think the general example is very good. Ecology comes from two Greek words, oikos and logos. Oikos is the house, logos is knowledge. So ecology is knowledge of the house. So ecology is all about an interior, like a system. So I think whatever is happening with ecology today, you would say it's kind of part of the evolution of the idea of the interior. Anyone else?
I think that's it. Actually, I was asking as far as the security cameras.
Oh, security cameras, yeah.
Actually, I think we're in Germany, it's not that Russia. And you being outside, there's still somebody's small monitor.
Yeah.
And you're assuming how you feel.
So, I mean, my feelings were shouldn't react to these things, I mean, because they were really very clear and very precise. Like you have built on the ideas of the morning, and it's clear that we could go for another 6 hours thinking about the new positions of interior, and all of you were making very, very, I think, very precise and interesting observations about the sort of weird state of the interior today. We were doing, of course, something different, which was giving you kind of historical examples. So basically the workshop was a kind of tennis match between long historical examples dating from the post-war up until recently, with you guys then delivering certain ideas about the interior from recent years. I think you're probably now in a very good position. For example, whenever you hear an architect give a lecture, just say to yourself, if this person is interested, I'm going to hear something interesting about the interior. I'm going to hear a change in assumptions about the interior. And if you don't hear any of that, you have every right to think, this is a boring person. Because in my world, the world in which I just tell my friend in the next room that we should go and have a coffee, the interior is really going through a big change. So if architects are not reacting to that, they're probably addressing old issues. And for your generation, the mandate is quite different, which is how to negotiate a place for architecture in this evolution. And you could argue, maybe, that in every moment of the history that we've been talking to, architecture always had a kind of a double role, which is to maintain an image of the traditional house. And the reason you need an image of the traditional house is precisely because there isn't a traditional house. In other words, actually, the internet doesn't make the desire for architecture go away. You could even argue it becomes even more important that people need these sort of images of a concept of interior that is no longer existing. But then there's another side of architecture which is trying to connect to what's happening. Architecture itself is perhaps the lowest technology discipline. If you can think of another field that's lower technology, like we've said tonight. Right? We are the lowest, slowest technology, which frees us up to be very creative and theoretical and philosophical about technology, because we don't really use it. Right? So paradoxically, architecture is a great place to think about the meaning of the internet, the meaning of information, the meaning of all those things. Precisely because as a medium, we are like, you know,
for the most part, low-tech.
Low-tech. It's like super low-tech.
Some architects want to be high-tech. I mean, they are aesthetic, right?
But, you know, so it's not about saying, because we live in a world of electronic technology, you have to make a kind of electronic architecture that goes with that. You should know electronics has been with us since before the Second World War. Electronics are really the product of Second World War military advances. And we're basically living now in a world theorized and conceived during the Second World War. So there's no big surprise. It's not like radically new world we live in. It's kind of an extension of an old argument. And as architects, you have a lot of freedom to move your ideas up and down. What you don't have freedom is to have no ideas. So basically, if an architect makes you a lecture in which you don't hear any idea about what might be happening with the interior, you should shoot them. Just, you know, because they but I also can speak for me, and I'm sure Beatriz feels the same way. We really like the mood of the class. I mean, before we started, we were 31 students. Now we're really going to work out.
But then in the end, I thought it was really nice this morning when we start hearing what you were thinking, and I thought that was really very interesting.
Yeah.
So I'm very happy that even with these big numbers, we can still maintain this kind of interaction, which I think is really very important. And it's part of the tradition of the Staedelschule. Like, you know, it's not about lecturing and disappearing. It's about more about discussing issues that we don't even know the answer for, but we think are important issues, and making you part of that discussion. So again, it's like a collaborative think tank. And we leave, and then I'm sure that you keep thinking about those things and other things that other people tell you, and then we come back and we are in another level. I think that's what we are trying to accomplish. Cool.
See you next time.
Damian?